So I welcome everyone to a workshop. I'm not in picture right now, but we're going to have a workshop with Dr. Timothy Musgrove. We are at the John Hick Centenary Conference 2022 at the UWC Red Cross Nordic. And I'm just going to give the floor to Dr. Musgrove.
Thanks a lot, Dan. And thank you for organizing this conference and having the inspiration to have this conference. I didn't know you before you reached out and contacted me, but I'm not surprised to be contacted as someone in California from someone in Norway, because John Hick had such a global reach, and his work, as I think everyone understands by now, was global in nature, and people all over the world have been drawn to engage with his thinking. And for you intrepid souls who've signed up for this workshop, I know you must have figured out it's a marathon. You're getting a lot crammed into 3 hours. It's a lot to ask of you. We're going to go through 50 years of John's career, roughly, inside of 3 hours. So I'll try to make it not be too tortuous, but thank you for signing up. And I can see you guys pretty well in the camera view, so feel free to raise your hand. The best way to do this is to ask questions as they come. It's too bad I couldn't be there in person, but we'll do the best we can with Zoom. Before I start the slides, I just want to say a little bit for a couple of minutes about who I am and what my relationship to John Hick was, so that you kind of know who it is that's talking to you. So John did the last 10 years of his career at the Claremont Graduate School in Southern California, and I caught him in the middle of that 10-year period and sort of rode it all the way to the end, literally, meaning I was the last PhD student of John Hick, or I was literally the last PhD dissertation that he signed off on was mine. And then I stayed in touch with him off and on over the years, found any excuse I could to cross the Atlantic and spend time with him in England when I could, and in fact was reviewing drafts of his articles to give him feedback, and he was reviewing drafts of things that I was working on up until within a few months of when he passed away was the last time I had visited him at his home in Birmingham, England. But going back during the Claremont years, those were really John's glory years. That was when he was really becoming really world famous. I mean, he had already been well known in earlier decades, but his as you'll see, his Gifford lectures that were published as his book, An Interpretation of Religion, really put John on the world stage. And because of his presence in Claremont, everyone wanted to come to Claremont to dialogue with John Hick at the time during this decade, especially say the early 1990s, late 80s, early 90s. And so we had all the world-renowned scholars coming and visiting in Claremont to participate in conferences with John Hick, and there were people like Elie Wiesel and the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and the foremost Zen master in all of Japan at the time, the Roshi Kaido Fukushima, and philosophy of religion and theology scholars like Paul Knitter and Alvin Plantinga and so on. And Keith Ward, the chair of the theology department at Oxford University, came over for a whole semester to Claremont. So it was just a ridiculous privilege to be there at that time. And besides that, John Hick was more to me than just an academic professor. He was really a mentor, somewhat a life mentor because just to be around him in person, he sort of exuded a different vibe. He really walked his talk and sort of lived the principles that he believed in as a philosopher and as a theologian. Just a couple things I want to share there about him that I think really stood out as a person. I was always amazed watching John Hick being attacked in person. It would usually be at conferences, and people would show up, but there were hecklers in the audience always, because, you know, his ideas were in some people's eyes very radical and very offensive. And he could get attacked from both extremes. He could get attacked from a radical feminist that didn't think John was progressive enough, and a minute later get attacked from a conservative Christian evangelical who thought that John was way too radical, right? And what was amazing is how cool as a cucumber, we would say, that John Hick always was. Like, he never, some of these attacks would get personal, and he never retorted back in kind. He was always as calm. He would always feed back the best version of his detractors' argument that you could make. In other words, instead of straw manning them, he would steel man them. So straw man is a fallacy, you know, where you caricature your opponent's position to something simpler and sillier than it really is, so that it's easier to attack. John would always do the opposite of that. He would try to see the best version of the argument whoever was disagreeing with him that you could make, so that he could then react to sort of the best form of their objection that you can imagine it to be. And he would do so calmly and with amazing self-control. And then there would always be, John was very social. There would always be these receptions before and afterwards of these events, and other informal gatherings, meals and things like that. And what would usually happen, if you watch a lot of professors in those environments, is that they tend to follow common human nature, which is they tend to sometimes dialogue more with the most prominent individuals. You know, so if there's two famous professors at the dinner table and a bunch of random students, the two famous professors get to talk to John Hick the most, you would think, because of their prestige. But it wasn't like that with John Hick. Or sometimes the more charismatic, more talkative individuals, even if it's just among a group of students, will get the most attention because they're more outgoing. They're extroverts. That would not happen with John Hick. I would notice him all the time. He would reach out to every person that was around him, socially, at a reception, at a dinner, anything like that, and he would get to know their names and ask them where they're from. And even the shyest student, he would reach out to. It was just really remarkable. And then if you read the biography of his life, there's as much, you could fill a conference with just the things John did, rather than a week of all the things John thought and wrote about. Some of that was mentioned in David Cheatham's wonderful opening keynote on Monday, that John had fought. And I think his son Peter Hick mentioned it, actually, that John had fought against neo-Nazis in England when John was much younger. John also fought against police mistreatment of blacks in England when John was very young. And the list of those kinds of things goes on and on and on. And actually going out and making interfaith dialogue happen, actually going to meetings and meeting people of different religions, just to establish relationships, and just as a matter of community, not as a matter of philosophy. So he struck me as this person that I wanted him to rub off on me in many ways, not just academically, but as a person on the whole. And I'm just very, very lucky that I got to be around him for the years that I was. And then I'll share with you one little thing. I have a prop here. We often have authors sign their books for us, and we take away a copy of their book. And of course, I did that with John, and lots of people did. And John had so many people ask him to sign books, it becomes routine, right? And he would usually write, "With best wishes, John," "With best wishes, John." And that's how he would sign for you. If he was here and you handed him a book right now, probably. And he signed a lot of books for me that way. But then I have this copy of Evil and the God of Love that you can see is falling apart because I beat it to death, and I have all my margin notes in it, and the pages are actually coming out. And here's the page that John signed, and you probably can't really read it, but this is where he didn't just say "with best wishes." He wrote, Tim, both the most appreciative and most constructively critical reader, with thanks, John. So this is like one of the most precious pieces of paper to me. And when John wrote this and then I read it, I hit that phrase, most constructively critical. And it sort of made a light bulb go on for me, which is that it was kind of a running joke. John didn't have a lot of students that were the most constructively critical. We throw around that phrase constructive criticism, and a lot of times it's a euphemism. Oh, I'm criticizing you, but don't worry, it's a constructive criticism, right? But John was notorious for having a lot of students that were not as open-minded, progressive, and radical as John Hick was. They would often end up defending a more conservative, more traditional, more orthodox position on religion than John Hick had. So a lot of his students, like Stephen T. Davis and other students, they had great relations with John, but they struck a more traditional orthodox position in their careers later on. And I was one of the few that I tend to agree with John Hick on almost everything. I share the same project as John Hick. Sometimes, though, I am critical of John's argumentation. Sometimes I think there's an alternative way to reach the same conclusion as John. I agree with him in the end on the conclusion, but sometimes I disagree about what the most effective way is to argue that that position. And so when he wrote that and signing that book, that was when I realized, yeah, that's kind of what I am with respect to John Hick, is that I'm trying to be constructive and help him push forward his project of Irenaean theodicy and of religious pluralism and so on. Although sometimes I have a criticism of exactly how John Hick argued it. I won't give you a lot of that in these 3 hours, because the purpose of this really is just to walk you through the evolution of John's thought over the period. But in a few spots, and I'll call it out when I do it, in a few spots I'll say, hey, here's a place where I think John missed something, or there could have been another way that he could argue this. So if there aren't any questions about that, then without further ado, we will get going with the presentation here of the books that the particular books that we're going to talk about. Okay. Let's see. There we go. So 5 decades, 5 major works. John is the only philosopher, period, that I know of in the 20th century, not just in philosophy of religion, of whom you can correctly say that in 5 decades in a row, John Hick published a book that just commanded the attention of all scholars in his field of specialization. And these are the 5 books. And John Hick actually once told me that he felt this way about these 5 books, that these were the five most important books that he ever wrote, because he wrote a lot of books, right? But these were the 5 most significant ones. Footnote, later in his life, you could add a 6th decade. He followed up with The New Frontier of Religion and Science in 2006. That did not have as much influence as the first 5 books, but John felt that it was his way of sort of wrapping up his life work. And it was sort of, putting a ribbon or putting a bow on everything that had gone before. But these 5 are the 5 that sort of rocked the world a little bit. And so we're going to go through these 5 in order and go really fast. And then I'll try to talk about the connections between them and how John's thought is sort of evolving as we move from one book to the next. So we're going to look at in the 1950s, John starts in the epistemology of religion. This was based on his own PhD dissertation. and it pretty much won him a posting at Cornell University, and that's what brought John to the United States for the very first time. And then an even bigger smash was in the 1960s, Evil and the God of Love. And this really, really shook people up, and made him be understood as a very controversial figure, but a very formidable figure. And then in the 1970s, he did what was at the time, and arguably still is, the most thorough, exhaustive, detailed analysis of evidence for and against there being life after death. Very, very important. And then the 1980s, really his magnum opus, John's Gifford Lectures, an interpretation of religion, still his most inclusive work, sort of putting everything together. And then he took on the doctrine of divine incarnation, whether Jesus was really just simply God in the flesh, and took that on and challenged that in a major way. He had challenged it earlier in articles and in smaller pieces, but he did a full book-length treatment of that in 1993, The Metaphor of God Incarnate. So those are the ones that we're going to look at, and we're going to look at them in that order. So let's look at faith and knowledge. So I'll start each book with a list of sort of the major themes or the major steps. It's really impossible to do this. Anyone who's read this book or any one of these books could always argue that that I could have and should have pulled out different themes. But anyway, this is my impression of what John, what are the high points of what John does in each book. So in this book, Faith and Knowledge, it's in the epistemology of religion. So epistemology in general is the theory of knowledge. It's a branch of philosophy, the theory of knowledge. So epistemology is really trying to answer the question, how do you know when you know? Which is a really puzzling question, right? We always think we have beliefs and then we have knowledge. Knowledge is more than just a belief. Knowledge is a belief that turns out to be true for the right reasons. We usually define knowledge as a justified true belief. It has to be true and it has to be justified. You have to have justification. So if you accidentally stumble on a true belief for bad reasons, it doesn't count as knowledge usually. So that's kind of epistemology. Epistemology of religion is asking a question that some people, a lot of atheists, for example, think that this question never gets off the ground. It's asking the question, how, if at all, do we have knowledge in religion? How do we have knowledge of anything that is of religious importance? So how do we have any knowledge of God or of the soul or of the afterlife? And is the answer, well, we can't because none of those things really exist? Or is the answer, they exist or might exist, but they're beyond the reach of our knowledge? Or is the answer, yeah, we can have a sort of knowledge about those things? So faith and knowledge, by putting those together in the title, John is asking you to think of them as being connected. Can your faith bring you to religious knowledge? Does faith already have a relationship to knowledge? Is faith in a way a kind of religious knowledge? So that's where this book starts out from. And then some things that end up being very important. We're going to talk about the ambiguity of the universe and why that's so important to John Hick. The ambiguity of the universe. This is the trite cliche question that everybody thinks philosophy is, right? You ask the average person who knows almost nothing about philosophy, what's philosophy? They're as likely as anything else to say, oh, that's like asking, what's the meaning of life? What's the meaning of life? You hear that a lot. And people think that what philosophers do is they try to answer what's the meaning of life. Well, the fact that everybody seems to think that's such a big question and such a common question already tells you that there's a fundamental ambiguity of the whole, of everything, of the whole universe in general, right? If there's no consensus on what's the meaning of life, it kind of means that like the whole deal of human experience is sort of ambiguous. You can't tell what the point of it is. John thinks that this is actually a good thing, that it's ambiguous, and that it's very important to recognize that it's ambiguous and that it's permanently ambiguous. So we'll look at why that's the case. An alternative concept of faith as experiencing as, John coined that phrase, as David Cheatham explained on Monday, and put it forward as an improved definition of what faith is. We'll talk about why he believed that. The scope and limits of religious experience in contributing to faith. Is faith something that you should have only if you had a religious experience, and it's because you had this wonderful religious experience one day, that's why you have faith now? And then someone else who hasn't yet had a religious experience, they shouldn't be expected to have faith? Is that the case? John actually doesn't think so. There's a different way that religious experience is relevant to faith, but not like what I just said. And we'll look at why he thinks that. And then the reasonableness of faith compared to other domains, other epistemological paradigms. So for example, is faith equally reasonable or less reasonable than scientific assertions or ethical or moral assertions, right? Is believing in the golden rule more sound and more reasonable than believing in God? Or is believing that an atom is made of protons, electrons, and neutrons, is that more well-grounded in reason than the belief that we have a soul? How do religious assertions and beliefs measure up against the beliefs that we have in science and in ethics? And then finally, eschatological verification. Eschatology is the study of last things, final things, how the whole history of the universe will end up in the most cosmic way imaginable. So if you believe everybody is going to go to heaven, or you believe that everybody's going to go to hell, or that some will go to heaven and some will go to hell, then that's your eschatology, right? And John introduces this idea of eschatological verification. And why is that so? Why is it so important to John to prove that in principle we could verify whether some religious beliefs were true or not once we reach the eschaton, the final state of things? And why does it matter even in principle that we could do that? So the first thing that John does is he takes on what's called the voluntarist concept of faith. Voluntarist is related to the word, volunteer or voluntary. It means of your own free will, right? So it's about the will. And this is the definition of faith that most people on the street still today usually have. You ask them, what's faith? They'll say it's choosing. So there's your free will. It's choosing to believe something in spite of a lack of sufficient evidence for it. So it's not only is it not proven, but there's not even enough evidence that on the basis of reason and logic alone, you would ordinarily believe in it. But because you want to believe, you decide to stretch beyond what the evidence will support and just choose to believe it anyway. And just by force of will, you just sort of tell yourself, it's real, it's real, it's real, right? And that's what faith is. And Hick says, no, it's not. That's not what faith is. And he thinks it's a terrible definition of faith. It defines faith as something reckless of evidence and probability, right? What Hick's project is he's trying to make the most epistemologically strong and solid and well defended definition of faith that is possible to have. And so voluntarism is not the place that he wants to start. So another argument that's very important for why Hick rejects the voluntarist definition of faith is he just thinks that it doesn't accord very well with how real religious people define faith for themselves. That in ordinary usage, religious people count their faith as, in a way, some form of knowledge, right? So in other words, it's not just wishing that something is true. That's hope. Hope and faith are not the same thing. Just wishing that something is true is hope. Faith is some part of the way you live your life that makes you know that it's true. So voluntarism, though, by its very definition, puts faith outside the realm of knowledge. In fact, it praises faith. You're supposed to admire, the voluntarists say you're supposed to admire people that have faith because they're willing to go beyond knowledge, to go where knowledge is not. They're willing through sheer force of will to base their life upon a belief that they don't have knowledge of, and that's admirable. And Hick says, I have a problem with that because the way people of faith actually report their own lives is they say, my faith is how I know that God is real, or that God is present in my life. So therefore, the voluntarist notion doesn't correspond to the ordinary usage of the word faith, as people very frequently use that word. And this kind of argument is sometimes in philosophy in general called an ordinary language argument, which stems again from Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein talked about language on holiday, where sometimes our language, sometimes in academia, we take a word and we make it mean something so far away from what it means in ordinary daily conversation that it's like the language has taken a holiday. It's gone far away from its home. And that what we should do is we should bring words back home, back to how they're used by everyday people. So to an extent, that's what John thinks he's doing with the word faith by moving on to something else. So as far as the ambiguity of the universe goes, this is a critical component of faith for John. And he does think that faith is a reaction to the ambiguity of the universe. And the ambiguity of the universe, it's different from saying there isn't enough evidence to believe, but I'm going to believe anyway. The ambiguity is like saying it's a tie score. Like there's two equally valid, but neither of them proven ways of interpreting my total experience of the universe. Either a purely physicalist, naturalist interpretation, or I could say there's nothing that exists but molecules and atoms, and when we die, and there's nothing transcendent. And there's another way to interpret the universe, that it's all a very beautiful, purposeful creation that implies or suggests that behind it is a purpose and meaning and design, and a place where souls exist and can meet and interact with one another, and those souls could possibly survive death, and that you can't really prove either one of these. It's sort of ambiguous, right? And so Hick has an argument that this ambiguity is actually good. Now, this is so remarkable in 1957 for John to be doing this, because up to this point, what almost every philosopher of religion thinks their project should be to defend faith is that they should try to prove the existence of God. They should try to make one side win. They should try to make their side win of the debate between theism and atheism, right? And John Hick is like, no, that's missing the point. If there is a God, and the evidence of God in our lives was so strong that you could actually prove God exists, then it would be overwhelming, right? If mortals couldn't help but believe in God, like you'd have to be an idiot not to believe in God, because the proof is so palpable right in front of you that only an idiot could miss it, then there would be no room to choose freely whether or not you want to acknowledge God. In order for there to be human freedom to choose whether you want to acknowledge God or not, it needs to be not patently obvious that there's a God. It needs to be at least somewhat ambiguous whether there's a God or not. And note, by the way, that John is not a religious pluralist yet by any means when he writes this book. So he's completely thinking in a Christian context, and he's completely talking about the Christian God here. So there are two sides of this ambiguity. So you're kind of saying if you were God who wanted to create the most magnificent creatures that you could, right? you would want those creatures to have freedom, and you want those creatures to be able to freely choose God, right? So you would want it to not weigh too much either direction. You would want the evidence to look sort of neutral. You would want there to be some evidence that is suggestive to these creatures that you, God, exist, because you don't want them to always be atheists. So you want there to be some hints in the created environment that there might be a God, but you don't want those hints to be so strong that it's just patently obvious that you want to get it just right. You want to land at this sort of equilibrium of evidence that makes it utterly ambiguous. So this then brings in Wittgenstein and experiencing as, and David Cheatham covered this on Monday with the duck rabbit. The duck rabbit drawing had been around for some decades before Wittgenstein, but nobody was paying attention to it. And Wittgenstein brought it up as, seeing as. You can see this as a duck or a rabbit. And over the years, people have had different versions of this drawing. And there's the original one. And here's a fun one that you can get on a t-shirt if you want, if you look on the internet. And so this speaks to that ambiguity of the universe, that you can see it as just a purely physical place and there's no transcendent, or you can see the whole universe as a place that has religious significance. And note that in this book, it's the 1950s. John is not yet applying this to religious pluralism. He's going to do that in later years. He is not even thinking this means that when you have a religious experience, you could experience it as a Hindu or as a Christian, and those two different religions would experience it as something. He's not even thinking that yet. He's thinking of this more fundamental rock bottom ambiguity of you could experience the whole world as just a material place, or you could experience it as a place that mediates the transcendent to those who want to be open to that. So let's see. John then gives an experiment, an interesting thought experiment. So, and do it with me over the next 3 slides. Take a look at this. What's happening here? If you just stumbled into a room, came in through a side door, and at first glance, you got this visual information, what would you think is going on here? And then as you have a moment longer to get your wits about you and collect more visual information from around the room, you start to look around, and then you notice this much. Now, what do you think is going on? Has it possibly changed? What's really going on here? And then a couple more moments go by, and you look around and collect even more information in the room until you finally see this much. So what do you suppose happened? Does anybody want to say what might have changed from the first view all the way to the final view of the room?
Yeah. The first frame that you showed us looked like they were fighting, and that would have been a sensible conclusion to make. But as you got out of the frame, it looks like they are filming a shot.
So there's basically an explanation given afterwards for this kind of position, which would have been interpreted very differently.
That's exactly right. That's a very good response. That's exactly what John Hick wants you to realize. And the exact example he explains in the book is, he says, suppose you enter a warehouse you've never been before, and it's dark, and there's some people having what looks like a secret meeting, and they have plans, and they're plotting to overthrow the government. And you're thinking, oh my God, I need to sneak out of here before I'm discovered and go report these guys. But then just as you're about to leave, you notice a camera over there, and you notice someone with notes over there, and suddenly it clicks and you realize, oh, they're just making a movie. So I couldn't find visual imagery exactly like that, but I found the ones that you saw here. And the importance of this is that the duck rabbit is just one drawing of just one thing, a duck or a rabbit. This example makes you realize that you could apply that seeing as to the totality of the sense experience you're having right now. The colors, sounds, smells, everything, wherever you are in the room that you're in, the entire scene that you're experiencing could be subject to that duck rabbit kind of duality, where it could suddenly flip and you like where I think the duck rabbit, all of us, when we see the duck rabbit diagram, first you see it as a duck, and then your awareness just flips and you're like, oh, now I can see how it could be a rabbit too. And you kind of did the same thing with this movie scene, right? These are two guys fighting, and then suddenly you're like, oh wait, now I can see they're just making a movie. And so John's point is that this could apply more in a larger sphere. It can, and so you just keep going. You move from a limited sphere, just one drawing, duck, rabbit. Then you go through this thought experiment of the movie scene. You're like, wait, it could apply to one whole scene and one particular moment when I stumble into a room. And then he says, now just go even farther. Now make it apply. Now make the duck rabbit kind of phenomenon apply to your whole life, everything you've ever experienced about the world. Could you see how you could look back on your whole life and realize there's a duck rabbit thing going on? There's two possible interpretations: the purely materialistic interpretation of everything that's gone on in your life and in your world, or a religious interpretation, right? And you can never only all analogies break down somewhere, right? So in this one you eventually stumble on definitive proof of which one it is. You see the camera and you realize, I think this guy on the right is interesting, because at first it looks like he might be saying, stop fighting, right? And you still don't know it's a movie. And by the time you get to here, you realize that that guy going like this is probably the director, right? But you see the cameras. So just suppose instead of that you never find definitive proof of whether this is a movie or not. Guess what? There's a real movie about that. Have you guys seen Tropic Thunder? Raise your hand if you've seen Tropic Thunder. Oh, nobody has seen it. Wow, see, typical American here, right? It's a ridiculous, silly movie. It is not like an Oscar-winning caliber movie, right? But what it is, this is a movie about some guys making a movie. I won't give any spoilers. I'll just tell you the setup of the movie. These guys you see are actors making a Vietnam movie, and the director decides to do something unique to get more method acting out of them, to get more genuine reactions out of them. He wants them to do improv acting. He wants to actually go to Vietnam and create a simulated environment and have a pyrotechnics expert set off artificial bombs, and they'll be firing fake bullets. And he wants the guys to just have like an outline of a script and sort of improv the exact lines and get more of a natural, spontaneous way of making this film. So they go over and they do that, but then it starts to appear that something has gone wrong, and that maybe they've wandered off, and the director has disappeared, and apparently might have been killed, or did he fake his death as part of the simulation? In other words, it creates ambiguity where these guys start to not be able to tell if they're still in this simulation of movie making, or maybe whether they've really just stumbled into a part of the jungle in Vietnam where they're really encountering real bad guys, and this is not an artificial movie making simulation environment anymore. And there's a part where the audience, if you're watching this movie, there's a part where you can't tell either, where it's ambiguous, and you're like, wait, is this still the immersion simulation, or are these guys now in a real legit jungle with real legitimate bombs going off? And so it's made to be a dramatic comedy, and it's kind of a silly movie. But it's an interesting example of oddly of exactly the kind of thought experiment John was trying to do. So the point of this is that going back here, that's what John's replacement concept of faith is. Faith is this total interpretation that you choose to make of the totality of existence and the totality of the universe. It's you choosing to see it as a duck instead of a rabbit, but applied to everything, right? And when you do that, then it changes your experience. So let's go back to the duck rabbit thing, right? Like if you chose to see it as a duck, then when you see other similar drawings, you'll probably continue to see those as a duck. Whereas if you choose to see it as a rabbit and you see other drawings, so if you choose to lean toward rabbit, then you could become the kind of person who's gonna have a tendency over and over. And notice that it's pre-reflective. So on the duck rabbit, you probably don't see it the first time you saw it. You probably didn't see it and go, what is this? And then do a very conscious analytical process and slowly come to the conclusion that it's a duck. You probably instantly saw it as either a duck or a rabbit. You probably instantly saw it as a duck and then had to work a little bit to see it as a rabbit, or the other way around. So people having faith, to John, they're sort of always experiencing the world as though it has religious significance. They're not doing it really philosophically. They're doing it just because that's the total interpretive lens that they have. So let's talk about religious experience now. Again, these mountaintop experiences that we hear about, maybe you've had happen. This will be here if you're not too shy. Raise your hand if you've ever had what you would call a religious experience or a spiritual experience or a mystical experience that you just thought stood out from everyday experience. I can raise my hand because I have. Has anybody had that? At least one person? Yeah. So, some of us have these, and I think odds are a little more than 50% of people do sometime in their lifetime. And you all are very young, so if you haven't had one yet, statistically odds are pretty high, or at least pretty even, at least that sometime in your life you will. In John Hick's view, you don't need an experience like that to have faith. And if you do have faith, it doesn't necessarily make it more likely that you're going to have that kind of experience. If you have that kind of experience and you have faith, then they will fit together. They will fit together nicely, probably. Your faith will be the way that you interpret that experience. If you don't have faith, you don't take a religious interpretation of the world, and you have that experience, then you're not forced, you're not even psychologically compelled to start having faith just because you had that experience. There's always ways to explain it away. You could say, well, it's something about my brain chemistry, and it made me feel really elated and really connected and really one with the universe and stuff like that. But it's really just a fluke. It's really just an aberration that lasted a few minutes in my brain chemistry, and I shouldn't read anything into it, right? So you can always reduce it to a mere neurological happenstance and just move on completely non-religiously, or you can interpret it religiously as having significance. So you never get away from that ambiguity of the universe for John, even if you have a really intense religious, possibly religious experience, right? You never get away from that duck rabbit ambiguity. On the other hand, ordinary experiences, if you're a person of faith, like just walking your dog in the park, become part of religious experience if you're a person with strong faith, right? Because you start to see, sort of the beauty and the freedom of the world, and the fact that conscious moral agents can connect with one another, and try to love each other and have compassion for each other. You see all that as sort of the religious purpose of everything, of everything existing, as an answer to the question why, one of the most profound philosophical questions is why is there something and not nothing? Why is there a universe? Why is there anything? And when you're on this side of the duck rabbit thing with the whole universe, and you're saying, I'm taking a religious interpretation of the universe, you have an answer to that. When you have an answer to that, then even simple scenes like this one, walking the dog in the park, count as an ordinary, everyday religious experience. It's not really it's not really a religious experience per se. It's more like there's a religious element in your interpretation of all experience. All experience is interpreted. You never have an unadulterated experience. Almost all philosophers and psychologists today will agree that pure experience, raw experience is kind of a myth. Our concepts and our mind are always imposing a filter on our experience. You're always interpreting your experience somehow. And so it may or may not be a religious experience. When you take a religious interpretation, potentially all your experiences have some religious significance. Next, we move to verificationism, right? Verificationism was a movement in philosophy, not just philosophy of religion, but philosophy of science, epistemology in the early 20th century that sort of spent itself. And what it was the idea that if you speak a sentence and it's impossible, that's an assertion of fact, and it's impossible in principle ever for anyone to even conceivably verify that, then it's meaningless. Another version of it was if it's impossible for anybody to ever falsify something you say, then you shouldn't even say it because it's meaningless, right? Things are meaningless that can be never ever in principle verified or never ever in principle falsified. The reason that the movement died or was dying right around the time John Hick wrote this book was because people were realizing there's too many counterexamples like the sentences on the right. Let's just take, we don't have time to play with all of these, but let's just play with some of these. Let's play with the first one. Raise your hand if you can tell me whether it would be possible to ever verify or falsify, whichever side of that you want to talk about, the first sentence, that somewhere in outer space there has to be a point that's the geometric center of the, even if it would be incredibly hard to discover and calculate this, that in theory there has to be a spot out in outer space that's the geometric center of the universe. Does anybody want to suggest if you could does anybody want to argue whether you could ever verify that or ever falsify that?
I think you can verify that in theory. So in theory, like you can say that we can build apparatus to travel to outer space and make, like in the future we can come up with those technologies to verify this, but it's just very hard and it's currently not practical, and I'm not sure whether we need to consider the practicality of things when we're trying to say whether or not we can verify or falsify.
Very good point. Very good point. Some people, and that's part of the controversy, some people do think we need to consider the practicality, others don't. So that was one of the problems with verification, is what you just said. What about when it's maybe in theory possible to verify it, but so impractical that it's almost certain we'll never be able to verify it? Another part of the controversy about this one is, so if we could, like you said, if we could build vehicles and travel to outer space and be sure, think about this part, if we could be sure we've discovered all the matter that there is, all the galaxies, and we mapped them, charted them, then we could calculate where the center point of all the planets, all the stars, all the comets, all the galaxies is. But how do you know when you've traveled far enough that you've found all of them? What if gazillions of light years away, after a lot of empty space, there's finally another galaxy? How could you ever know that there's not still more space and still more space and then finally more material? That would throw off your calculation of where the center is, right? And then people say, well, wait, maybe there's sort of a curvature, a bounded curvature of space. Maybe if you go enough light years away in a spaceship, you start to reappear on the other side of space again and come back again. Maybe space is like some weird Einsteinian space curvature sort of, spherical thing. Maybe there's sort of a, maybe there's a limit to how far you can go before you sort of just start returning. You wouldn't believe the weird conversations about this one sentence. At the end of the day, it's really hard to get agreement whether we could ever verify this. Let's look at another example. Here's an example that's a little more clear. Look at the 1/3 sentence down. There's a sequence of 3 consecutive 7s somewhere in the value of pi. That's a really good example because that's an example of one that you could verify but never falsify because the value of pi is never ending. So if we calculated the value of pi, 3.14 whatever, out to 1,000 decimal places, and we still haven't found 3 7s, then it means we've not verified it yet. But we also haven't falsified it because it goes on forever. Right? So if we ever do discover 3 7s in a row, we can verify this sentence is true. But we can never falsify it, right? Because no matter how far we go and we still haven't found 3 7s, we could still go farther and keep checking if we still might find 3 more 7s. And that's perpetually true forever and ever and ever. So this one is actually for sure, the reason I like this example, it's for sure verifiable and for sure not falsifiable. Then the next sentence right after it is the opposite. There's a volcano in Australia that is called an extinct volcano. But if you dig into what the geologists mean by extinct, they mean that it will probably, extinct means will probably never erupt again. They can't reduce the probability down to 0, right? It's just a very low probability that it will erupt again. So if you assert it will never erupt, this is falsifiable because if it erupts tomorrow, we have falsified it. But if it just keeps on not erupting, not erupting, not erupting, not erupting, that hasn't verified it because, I mean, unless the whole Earth explodes, right? As long as the volcano keeps existing and not erupting, there's still a chance it could erupt. So verification is odd. Verificationism saying that we shouldn't assert things, we shouldn't believe in things, we shouldn't waste our time with statements that can be neither verified nor falsified or either one. It's sort of an odd philosophical position, and it was running out of steam. Going back to John Hick, nonetheless, he cares. He cares about religious truth claims being verifiable. Because he does think, at a minimum, he does think that claims are less useful and less compelling if they're of a nature that in principle they can never be verified. And he doesn't want to let other philosophers claim that religious claims are all unverifiable, because that's a way of them being condescending, looking down their nose at looking down on religious claims as being lesser in status than most scientific claims, right? At least, scientific, a good thinking philosopher of science will say, okay, maybe some scientific claims are unverifiable or unfalsifiable, like some of the ones on the screen right now. But at least in general, Mr. Hick, the vast majority of scientific claims are both verifiable and falsifiable. Whereas in religion, sir, all the claims are completely unverifiable, right? John Hick doesn't want to stand for that, right? He wants to say, wait a minute, yes, verification is important, but yes, religious claims are in principle verifiable. How on earth is he going to do that? He's going to do that with a scatological verification. He's going to do that by saying, look, when we die in this mortal anatomy, there either will or won't be an afterlife. And if there's an afterlife plus more, just there being an afterlife isn't enough. If there's an afterlife, and in that afterlife, we can eventually see confirmation of some of the religious beliefs we had, then there could be verification. Ultimately, this would land so far in the future that it would be eschatological. It would be the end of all time. If at the end of all things, right, there's evidence of God, then the belief we have today of God in principle has future verification possible. It might be so distant in the future that it's many, 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 many lifetimes from now. It's like literally at the end of time, at the end of everything, but still in principle, verification can happen of our religious beliefs. So this is sort of John Hick saying, don't tell me that it's in principle unverifiable, because there's this thing called eschatology, please. And by that, we could verify that. Now, John needs to show, though, that life after death is at least a logical possibility. There's a difference between showing something as a logical possibility or impossibility and a physical possibility. Let me give you a quick example. So like a triangular object is a logical possibility. So you can sort of think it. You can think of triangle, 3 angles. You can think of a closed figure, meaning closed figure made of all straight lines, having exactly 3 angles, not 2, not 4, 3 angles in it. And then you can, it's a physical possibility because you could actually make a physical triangular object that in one of its planes is triangular. So it's both logical and physical possibility. But if I say make a triangular object that I can touch, right? But make it have 4 sides. That's not just a physical impossibility. You can't make a triangular object with, it's also a logical possibility. You can't make a triangle. A triangle can't have 4 sides on the basis of logic alone. You don't have to go and cut a piece of wood. You don't have to go into the physical realm to prove it. You can prove it with pure abstract logic, right? You can infer, and notice that the definition of triangle technically doesn't even mention sides. It's not just true by definition that a triangle doesn't have 4 sides. It's by definition, a triangle is a closed figure with 3 angles. But you can put logic and deduction together, and you can prove that if it's all straight lines and has 3 angles, therefore it will also have 3 sides, and exactly 3 sides, and never 4. So what John Hick wants to do with his eschatological verification is he wants to prove to you that it's at least a logical possibility that there could be life after death. And he does it with a thought experiment that has 3 steps. So let's take step number 1. Suppose someone disappears in England, just disappears, they vanish. Don't ask how. It could be magic, it could be science, it could be, maybe they get vaporized by a high-tech science fiction kind of weapon that some alien species had, maybe a magical wizard, maybe God. It doesn't matter if it's God, magic, or science, somehow this person disappears, right? And then somehow an exact physical replica of that person, that very instant, appears thousands of miles away in Australia. Again, doesn't matter, it's just a thought experiment, doesn't matter why or how. Maybe it's like the transporter, teleporter in the Star Trek TV series. Maybe they were beamed for, I don't know, whatever, or maybe it was magic, or maybe it was God. Again, doesn't matter why. Just they disappear in England, and an exact replica appears in Australia. The replica can breathe and can talk and can be introduced to people and can get on the telephone with the original guy's friends in England, and they talk to him, and all the friends and family confirm that this seems to be the same person. They accept him as the same person, right? And John submits that that's what these people would probably do, right? I mean, he looks the same, smells the same, talks the same, has the same attitude, makes the same bad jokes. They would say they very likely just say it's the same guy. Replica is in quotes because in this thought experiment, Hick is asking you to accept one more thing, which is that by whatever mechanism this replica is made, it's made in such a way that there can only be one, only a unique one. There can't be 10 versions of them suddenly appearing in 10 different cities. Whatever it is, it's of such a nature that it's one and only one replica. So you go to step 2. Now imagine that instead of just disappearing, vanishing, poof, in England, he actually dies, drops dead. But then the replica appears in Australia the same moment. This is a little weirder because now we have a body in the morgue that we can go and touch, if you want to touch a dead body, in England at the same time that we have a replica who talks and acts just like him in Australia. And John submits again that the friends and family of this person are likely to still accept him as John Smith or whatever his name was. Even though, in other words, even though there's a dead body in the morgue in this case, if they accepted him in the first example, everyone's gonna probably accept him in the second example as well as being the same person. Because it's one and only one replica. Finally, step 3. Now you're ready for step 3. Now just change the example again in just one way. Instead of the replica appearing in Australia, it appears in some other world. So the family and friends don't get to meet or get on the telephone with this replica this time because the replica has been created, but in another world so far away that we don't have immediate access to that world. It could be another planet. You don't have to go spiritual and transcendental and all, this doesn't have to be heaven. This could just be another planet. Many, many, many light years away, just out of reach of us for all practical purposes, right? Well, if we accept that it would be the same person in example 1 and example 2, what difference does it make if instead of it being in Australia, the replica shows up on another planet somewhere or in another world? So what Hick is doing is he's moving you to imagine that it's at least logically, now this doesn't mean it's physically possible, but that at least means it's logically possible. There's nothing, it's not like asking you to have a triangle with square sides. It's not like asking you to believe in a square circle. We're not asking you to believe in something that is incoherent or self-contradictory in asking you to imagine that someone could physically die, but then physically live again somewhere else and be the same person. And John liked this thought experiment so much that it's one of the few things it's one of a handful of things that he reused 2 books later in our series of books we're talking about today, Death and Eternal Life. John uses this example again with slight changes. So when John finishes this thought experiment, John now has satisfied himself in his book that he's made a good argument that religious truth claims are meaningful and significant because they can be verified, because there could be life after death, because life after death is a logical possibility, at least because of this thought experiment demonstrating that. So that therefore, in principle, he's just trying to show that in principle, there could be verification of religious truth claims post-mortem after we die, that it's not logically incoherent to suppose so or to imagine so. And that was a pretty big accomplishment in the 1950s because defenders of religious truth claims were very much on the defense at the time. They had been battered and beaten by the verificationists. A lot of people in academia were thinking religious truth claims are second-class status because they're unverifiable. And then John came out with this book and says, wait a second, cut that out. You have to expect them to be more difficult to verify. Remember, I don't know which student it was, but you pointed out the practicality, very impractical to build a spaceship, very hard to get out there and find where the center of the universe is, if there is a center. But that's what you should expect, because that's a very, very hard truth claim. Is there a center of the universe to verify? So don't complain that it would be so hard or impractical. You should expect it to be impractical. And that's kind of what John Hick is saying here, is saying religious truth claims are very big and magnificent. They're about the entire purpose of the whole universe from beginning to end. So why should it be weird that you would have to wait until the end to verify it? It's only what we should expect. And it's possible in principle that at the end of things, we will survive and we will be there in an afterlife and we will be able to verify it. And it's unrealistic to expect it to be any easier than that to verify religious truth claims. So this was like a very powerful defense of the reasonableness of believing religious truth claims around 1957. So finally, we're ready now to sort of finish up the last section of this book.
Jim, I have a question in the room here, if you have time for it.
Oh, yes, I do. Sorry, I didn't notice. What's the question?
I just want to quick pick up the point that, okay, so John Hick believes that we are all physical, right? And she also believes that when a physical dies, and would be, as in this thought experiment, for example, would be reincarnated again in a total different place, doesn't matter where. Basically, the soul he believes in and the physical body stays together in this sense, like it will be exactly the same replica. However, I'm thinking about like what makes him like put these two parts so close together that they could not be reincarnated without each other. So the soul couldn't be reincarnated without the body, or is it like, yeah, because I personally think, for example, that if there's reincarnation, it does not necessarily has to be a combination from the physical and the immaterial substances, such as soul. So what exactly is that? What is like having to combine these two for reincarnation?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and you've done a good job of anticipating what some of John Hick's critics would say about this. They would say the same thing. They would say even if the family and friends accept the replica in Australia as the same person, that doesn't really prove that it's the same person, right? And what's funny is John was actually somewhat of a fan of the Star Trek TV show, by the way, The Next Generation. But I always told him, but he never watched the original Star Trek series. And I told him that he should, because they do a lot of philosophy in that show. And one of them is that the teleporter, beam me up, Scotty, that beams, is that if you pay attention to the original Star Trek, there's a controversy between Spock, the science officer, and McCoy, the doctor, where McCoy doesn't like to be beamed anywhere. He'll take a space shuttle and travel physically down to the planet instead of being beamed down to it, because it's like this replica thought experiment. The transporter like dissolves all your molecules and atoms and shoots a beam and then reconstructs you. And McCoy thinks that you die every time, and there's a replica of you is made, and it's not the real you, right? So it is a very good criticism that this doesn't prove that a soul necessarily passes. But what Hick is doing, the reason he constructs the experiment this way, is because he's trying to separate himself from the debate over dualism. Dualism being that there's two fundamental parts of every one of us, our body and our soul, right? Versus the idea that there's just one thing, and our body and soul are sort of the same thing. And so notice that in this whole thought experiment about England, replica in Australia, John never mentions the word soul, because he doesn't want to. John used to always tell me, when you're trying to argue a point, argue the minimum number of points that you need to make the point you want to make. Don't get dragged into a lot of other debates in addition to the first debate you're trying to have. So Hick didn't want to get dragged into the whole dualism debate that's been raging in philosophy for hundreds of years, at least since Rene Descartes. And he wanted, so he wanted to say, look, whether you think there's a soul or not, just go through the thought experiment and realize that it's incredibly likely that all the friends and family of this guy are going to accept the replica. Don't even have to raise the question of, like, some of his friends and family might be atheists and naturalists and not believe in a soul. Others might believe in a soul. All of them are John submits, all of them are likely to accept this replica as their old friend or their old brother or cousin or nephew or whatever. So he's trying to dodge the debate over whether a soul exists and get to just whether the person can continue. So in a way, that's part of the magical powerfulness of Hick's argument here, is that he actually it gives them a way to actually have a kind of some kind of afterlife without having to talk about the soul. Where if a perfect replica of you were to be made and carry on, that would at least in some sense be you and be a continuation of you. We don't have to impose this ontology that says that souls exist different from the, different from the body. So there's a lot of options here. What if there's a 5-minute gap between when the guy disappears in England and appears in Australia? That's another version of this you have to think about. And let's suppose you believe in the soul, right? You could sort of believe that the soul disappears for 5 minutes and then coalesces again in Australia. Or you could believe that the soul is extinguished and a new soul has to be created in Australia. Or you could believe that the soul sort of is frozen, doesn't have any experience, doesn't move, doesn't think. It's just sort of like hitting the pause button on a video. And then 5 minutes later, when the Australia replica is created, it's like hitting resume play, right? There are all kinds of options here. Now, later in Hick's thought, he would absolutely say, we have souls and there's a soul making process, and our soul is what continues to be reincarnated. But in this early book, interestingly, he was trying to just dodge the debate about the soul entirely. And whether he did that successfully or not is subject to debate, and people have made a criticism along the lines that your question implies. So finally, and David Cheatham talked about this on Monday a little bit, Hick wants to finally argue that, going back to this duck rabbit thing, so choosing rabbit over duck on purpose, so like choosing to take a total interpretation of the universe that is a religious interpretation, he wants to argue is fundamentally no different than choosing to have any kind of ethics or morality at all in your life. Because there's a famous saying in philosophy, you cannot turn an is into an ought. Meaning that there's empirical observation of just the bare physical facts of what happens. And then there's the question of what ought to have happened, right? So if you're able-bodied and healthy and walking along a beautiful scenic trail that has a wonderful view, but it's by the side of a cliff, and there's some other people there, and you're perfectly healthy and strong and physically able, and someone almost in arm's reach of you, you see them stumble, and they're clearly about to fall over the cliff, which will be to their death. That's just what's happening. And you can either choose to reach out and just grab their sleeve and probably without much trouble, just save them, or you could choose to just go like this and watch them fall. And most of us will feel, oh my God, you're such a crappy person if you don't do anything, right? Right? Like kind of morally obligated to, especially if it's not too much trouble and a human life depends on it, to do something, right? And we say that's a moral interpretation. That's like a layer of interpretation that we lay over the top of the empirical interpretation. You're already making an empirical interpretation. You already have an interpretive layer just to experience the natural world. You do most of it unconsciously, but you do it. Most philosophers and scientists accept that. We talk about things like birds that can see into the infrared spectrum. We talk about bats that are blind but have sonar and fly around with sonar detection. We talk about, so we know that we observe the empirical world partly because of the kind of creatures we are. And then we can even talk about cultural differences, and in some cultures, their color words are different. In some words, they don't. In some cultures, their language, they don't have a word for the color green. They just have different shades of blue and different shades of yellow. They just have darker shades of yellow and more yellowish shades of blue, but they don't break out green as an independent color of equal status to blue and yellow, some language, and so on, right? But you know the color green. So you're just in thinking you're making bare empirical observations. Actually, your mind is already constructing the experience because you're you. But then when you add moral interpretation, you would say, hey, you know, not only did this person start to fall over a cliff and then this other person reached out and grabbed him, but also I admire that. And also he was doing what he should have done by saving her. So, and you assert that as though it's really true and really importantly true, even though it doesn't come right out of the bare facts. It's your interpretation. And then John says, then why is it any different? It's not fundamentally any different, is it? To then go one level higher and lay another layer of interpretation over the whole of our existence, which is a religious interpretation. Which is to say that, you know, this is, you know, this is a place where transcendent presence can be experienced, and it can be experienced as a place where people with souls are having an opportunity to perceive a transcendent presence in and throughout what they do in their daily lives. So it's a similar epistemological move. And so argumentally, see what John is doing is saying, he's saying, oh, you don't, you know, hey there, Mr. Philosopher, you think you don't like religious interpretation of the universe because it's epistemologically suspect somehow to you? Well, do you have any morality at all? Assuming you do, then you're doing the same thing. Just by having any morality at all, you're imposing a layer of interpretation, consciously or unconsciously, on the bare empirical world. So if that's a fair move to make, then likewise, taking a total interpretation that the world has a religious significance is equally as much a fair move to make on epistemological grounds. So he's not blind to the difference of what he calls the locus of the interpretation, because again, what is really the target of your of having faith? What is the focus in your mind when you have faith? It really is not any one thing in the universe. It's really the whole universe. It's really believing that the whole universe has a religious purpose, is what it really is. And so this does make some people think, well, then it's not really of the same epistemological paradigm as Hick asserts, because scientists don't do that. Usually, some physicists do, but you know what? There's a debate among scientists as to whether theoretical physicists are really scientists. I should have added that to the deck. There's a slide I have where there was a conference just a few years ago where these theoretical physicists that say theoretical physicists are kind of like Einstein. They don't do experiments. They're not empirical. They do things with their mind. They like dream stuff up, like, oh, but then they prove the mathematics of it, that it's theoretically possible. Like there could be a multiverse. There could be multiple universes and all this stuff. And scientists themselves, not philosophers, they get together and they debate whether theoretical physics is really science because it's not empirical. So putting theoretical physicists aside, someone could complain back to John. Scientists in general are specialists in one specific area, and they're not making statements about the whole universe on the whole, right? They're just saying that, the Western diamondback rattlesnake usually has its babies in the early spring of March or April, and then it's rare that it happens any later than May. Like they're just making these like very limited empirical observations and then trying to explain why. They don't dare to talk about the whole universe. So because of that, a lot of people want to say, wait a second, you can't say that taking a religious interpretation of the universe is just the same epistemological paradigm as what we use in science. And of course, the great comeback for Hick to make to that is, but what about theoretical physicists? They sure do so. Good point. And then you come back to, but wait, even theoretical physicists are sort of weirdos in the scientific community. Some people think they don't even deserve to be called scientists. So I think that's where that conversation kind of lands in a stalemate a little bit. So the yeah, I mean, we've really already covered what's on this slide. Is the image I put here is just meant to sort of symbolically represent that what faith is it's viewing the whole world through a different lens. And you look at it through some kind of lens. If you're an atheist naturalist, you also have the image that's on the screen right now. You also have a lens. You're just choosing a different lens. And you're back to that duck rabbit thing. You either choose the duck or the rabbit. You either choose the naturalist lens of viewing the whole world in a materialistic way, which you can't prove, or you use the other lens of interpreting the whole entire universe in a religious way, which also you can't prove. But what you can do is you can choose which lens that you want to use. And if you choose the religious lens, then you have faith. And it means that you experience it. It'll just change the way you experience the world. It isn't about a set of beliefs that you, through sheer force of will, believe even when there's no evidence. It isn't so much about that. It's that you have to choose one global interpretation of your total stream of experience, regardless. And when you choose a religious one, then you're having faith by virtue of just continuously every moment experiencing the world as having a different significance to it than if you didn't have faith. And that's it. And this really kind of, in terms of key takeaways, this idea of faith is experiencing the whole world as something different than another way you could experience it. It really was kind of a permanent development in the philosophy of religion after the publication of this book. A lot of philosophers of religion accepted it or something similar to it and still do to this day, defining faith as a total pre-reflective. Pre-reflective is important. Faith isn't something that you sit around and get taught and then consider it and then make a choice to believe in it. It's more an ongoing pre-reflective, pre-conscious way of experiencing the world as things are happening. And then another important kind of development here, Hick wasn't calling it epistemic distance yet. We're going to get to that label in the next book. In this book, he called it just the ambiguity of the universe. The idea that the ambiguity of the universe is just what we should expect if there is a God was like a revolution in philosophy of religion with this book. Again, that idea that if there's a God is going to want to leave intellectual room for us to be able to freely choose whether to believe in God or not. Because God would want us to choose God freely, not unfreely. So God would want us to, he would want to leave room for, God would want to leave room for doubt on both sides if there is a God. So what we should expect, we should not expect if there's a God to be able to find a way to prove God. If there's a God, we should expect the universe to be stubbornly, persistently ambiguous from an evidentiary standpoint as to whether the universe indicates God or doesn't indicate God. We should expect it to be stubbornly ambiguous. And lo and behold, it is ambiguous. So see what a verificationist John Hick is again, right? He's like, if there's a God, the universe should be ambiguous. Let's go check. Let's look at the universe. Oh, it is ambiguous. Just what we should expect if there's a God. Seems like it's reasonable to believe in God. That's a little bit of what's going on there.
So I have a room, Tim, if you want to take it.
Yes.
No, just a very quick one for clarification. You were repetitively talking about the choice we have to take a lens, or like the way we look at things. Also, I think it's again, yeah, as you mentioned regarding the example of the duck and the rabbit, right? Applying to like our whole experience, like the perspective we take and what we see. However, I can't really relate so far to what extent that actually a choice we can take into view it. Because, for example, when we look first at the picture, we directly saw something probably influenced by our previous experience, what we already had of previous knowledge, right? And that was again changed when we learned something new to it. So how can we say it is a choice to take this lens? Because you were using that word of choice of taking a lens quite often now. I just want to clarify that.
That's a very good point. And perhaps I oversimplified what John Hick really does in this book, because he doesn't really He doesn't really say you have a choice in the sense that anybody, everybody, it's guaranteed all 8 billion human beings on the planet could sit down right now and simply choose whether to take a religious interpretation of the universe and therefore have faith or not. He's not exactly saying that. What he means is that what he really means to say is that in principle we all have a choice because the universe is ambiguous. So it's just saying going back to the duck rabbit, it's just saying it's wrong to insist that drawing is a duck and not a rabbit, or is a rabbit and not a duck, that it is firmly ambiguous, and therefore it is and you can't have the experience looking at the diagram. Haven't you looked at it and over the space of a few seconds gone back and forth? Now I see it as a duck, now I see it as a rabbit, and you can kind of feel yourself choosing to see it as a duck and then choosing to see it as a rabbit. So again, we talked about logical possibility, and John just wants to prove that it's in principle possible. So like, it's in principle possible that you could look at the universe either way, naturalistically or religiously. But he's not trying to say, oh, it's an easy thing to just pick up one day and decide to have faith if you haven't had it, or decide to stop having faith if you always have had it. Also isn't very easy. He's not saying that you all have a choice in that sense. One final thing I would say there is for example, imagine this is a thought experiment that I did in class with John when we were talking about this all the years ago. So this comes from me, was my extension of this duck rabbit thing. I said, imagine that there's two cultures that have always been isolated on two different islands. And and they've never had contact with the outside world. And an explorer goes and visits both islands, and she shows the drawing of the duck rabbit to both of them. But on island A, the A and B, on island A, they have a big population of rabbits. They're used to them, and they have no ducks. Island B is the opposite. They have a big population of ducks and they have no rabbits. And it's like, you know what's gonna happen when you show them the drawing. They're gonna look, when you visit this island, show them the drawing and say, what is it? They're gonna say it's a rabbit. When you go to island B, they're all gonna say it's a duck. And if you try to get those folks to be able to see it both as a rabbit and duck, it's gonna be hard, right? It's gonna be hard, right? What would you do with people on island? You'd probably have to, the people on island A, you'd probably have to go to island B, borrow a few ducks, put them in your boat, bring them over to island A, show them off, then show the drawing again and say, see now do you see how it could be a duck instead of just a rabbit? And then they might start to get it slowly, right? So it goes back to your question, like it might be, even though it's still in principle, it's still possible for the people on both islands to see the drawing either way. But because of their background and their conditioning, it's going to be hard for them to see it one way instead of the other. So that the same thing is going to be true with people about faith. Even though it's in principle possible that for all of us that we could take either interpretation, some of them, because of our personal life history, are going to have a harder time taking one than the other. And Hick doesn't deny that. Well, I want to say, Dan, it seems like we're not progressing fast enough because we've only covered 1 out of 5 books and we're like half done with the time, but we took a lot of time to get started in introduction. And I intend to spend more time, all you guys, on faith and knowledge anyway, because it is the foundation. I have more slides on this book than any of the other books. The other books will go faster. This is the foundation of everything, and we'll be able to move faster through the other books. And maybe, Dan, are we getting close to the time where we should take a break? I don't know if Dan is still in the room or if he had to run over.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Don is right now not in the room, but maybe we could take like a 5-minute break or 3-minute break to just like, I don't know, drink something and come back.
I think that makes sense. Let's take 5 or 10 minutes or whatever, and then resume. Take your I'll go and get a snack for myself too.
Amazing. Can you see us, by the way? Because we have the camera on, but we're not sure. Can you see us?
Yes, I can see. I'll stop. Let's see. I'll stop the share for a minute. Yeah, I can see it. I can see tables and I can see someone waving and 3 or 4 of you there. Yeah,
Okay. Then see you back in like 3 to 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
sounds great.
No,
I'm not on, but I will be soon. Yeah.
just really quick, I'm wondering if that life after death maybe
Yes.
Okay, amazing.
So, evil and the God of love. So this comes out in 1966. And in Faith and Knowledge, John had basically been trying to, defend faith as a way of having a sort of knowledge where if you do take a religious interpretation of your experience of the universe, then it, as reported by people of faith for centuries, it does cohere, it does fit together. Your experience starts to fit together with that. And you can continue to make the interpretation successfully. So it's a little bit self-reinforcing. Except there's one part of this which is threatening, let's say, to tear apart John's entire project here. And that's pertaining to the ambiguity of the universe. A lot of people feel that the universe is not so ambiguous with respect to whether a God might exist. And that's because of the problem of evil. We call the problem of evil in philosophy of religion, is that there's so much evil and pain and suffering in the world that how could there possibly be an all good and all powerful God who would just sit back and let all of this continue, all this pain and suffering. And so theodicy, which comes from the Greek words deos and dike, which means God and justice. So theodicy, the word literally means a justification of God. So it's like a defense of God. It's like an answer to the question, why would God let this world be this way for so long, for so many centuries, so much suffering. And so a lot of people would say, wait, Professor Hick, I don't see the world as ambiguous. I see it as strongly weighing against there being a God. So I don't feel like there's sort of this equilibrium of ambiguity between a religious and a naturalist interpretation. And I don't see how you could take the religious interpretation because of the problem of evil. So this is a serious enough question that John decided to devote a whole other book just to this. And that's this book. And in it, he does something parallel to what he did in the last book. Notice in the last book, he took the most popular definition of faith, which was the voluntarist definition. It's using sheer force of will to believe in something that has inadequate evidence. And instead, he argued something completely differently. He argued that the evidence actually is ambiguous, but if you take one side of the interpretation, then that means you have faith and you'll experience the world according to that interpretation. He's going to do something similar here. He's going to take the long-standing approach and he's going to discard it. The long-standing approach is called Augustinian theodicy because it was most famously developed by St. Augustine in the early centuries AD. And it's, basically a free will defense, sort of as we'll see, evil is explained by our free will somehow in a way that we should not then view it as a reason not to believe in God. John Hick just thinks that doesn't work. And instead he goes to a different church father, these old theologians and philosophers from the early centuries of the church are called the church fathers sometimes. One is Augustine or Augustine, another is Irenaeus. And Irenaeus had a different theodicy, completely different from Augustine's, that as of 1966 had not been paid very much attention to. Almost the only significant thinker in the whole history of philosophy of religion and theology that had paid any attention to Irenaeus prior to John Hick was Friedrich Schleiermacher, a German theologian in the 19th century who did write a little bit about Irenaeus. And even though Schleiermacher is a pretty significant figure, pretty big name, Schleiermacher still didn't succeed in getting traction and getting the Irenaean theodicy to gain ground in academic circles with philosophers of religion and theologians around all the universities around the world. But boy, John Hick sure does in 1966. He develops the Irenaean theodicy in a far more robust and detailed way than Schleiermacher ever did. He pulls it out of the shadows. He demolishes the Augustinian theodicy with a bunch of counter arguments against it. And he completely changes the shape of the discussion in the field of philosophy of religion around theodicy ever since he published this book. And a lot of people in the world, in the academic world, consider this book to be the most important book that John Hick ever wrote. So let's start to take a look at it. And every once in a while, Zoom makes PowerPoint freeze. Okay, so let's take a look at the Augustinian theodicy. There are basically two components of this. Now remember, this is what for almost 2,000 years, the majority of Christian thinkers would have told you if you complained to them about the problem of evil or asked them. This is the stock answer, right? They would say number one, number two. Number one, God did not create evil. God only creates good things. And you're like, well, then how does evil exist? Who made it if God didn't make it? And Augustine will say, well, evil isn't something that got made. Evil is a decay or a deterioration in the good things that did get made. So God makes good things and sets up a good order. But if that order gets messed up, then what we can call it is evil. Okay. So evil is basically spoiled goodness. Now, there's a lot of appeal to this idea. It's kind of fun to do a thought experiment about this. Let's think of the most evil person you can think of. Why don't one of you guys suggest somebody? What's one of the most evil evil persons in history? Who comes to mind?
Hitler.
Hitler, Adolf Hitler. That's the most popular one. Okay. So tell me how you could interpret Hitler's evil as spoiled goodness.
I mean, Hitler's goal was to create like purify the Aryan race. So, oh goodness, could be he thinks that by merely taking out all disabled or whatever he deemed as not healthy, then he can advance humanity and make Germany the most healthy and sustainable country in a sense.
That's right. So I think you used the word purify or purification to create like a pure race or something like that. So just take that word out. He thought it was going to purify the Aryan race. Just take purify. Just take the word purify. Is that a positive word or a negative? That's a positive word, right? Like horribly applied in an evil way by Hitler if he thinks he's going to purify the human race by having racial purity, right? But sort of taking a positive concept, the concept of purity, and twisting it to an evil application. What about some of the individual characteristics or personality traits of Hitler? Do you think he had any personality traits that trait by itself in isolation, when it occurs in other people, could be a very positive trait? Can you think of one?
He works hard to get his power.
Did you say he worked hard?
Worked hard to get his power. And
yeah, he worked hard. Being a hard worker, we normally compliment people on that. That's a positive thing. So the list goes on. He was thought to be a very good public speaker, very charismatic. Some people said part of the reason he was able to accomplish so much evil was because he possessed some attributes that in isolation are good attributes. If he had been not hardworking and not charismatic and not a good public speaker, do you think he would have proceeded to do so much disastrous evil? Would he have succeeded in evil as much, right? So we could keep going with this, but we want to move on because we want to cover more material. But you can see how you can start to see the evil as people being endowed and blessed with positive qualities, but then putting them to the wrong purposes because of the choices that they make, right? So it doesn't seem on the face of it obviously stupid for Augustine to define evil as spoiled goodness and to say God created all the goodness. Then number two, it's because of original sin, Adam and Eve's free choice, that we fell from grace, that we started spoiling, the human race started spoiling. And you can take Adam and Eve mythologically if you want. You can say it's a metaphor for whoever the earliest humans were. Have you seen, I keep going back to the movies. Raise your hand if you've seen the movie 2001 Space Odyssey. Has anybody seen that? No? Somebody had, okay, so 2001 Space Odyssey, there's a scene in it where they go back to our primordial ancestors that are almost more similar to an ape than a modern human, right? Like Cro-Magnon or Neanderthal or something like that. And there's a scene where there's no words, but we see this guy beating, taking a stick or a bone or something and beating, I think beating gourds to pop them open just to get food. But then his other fellows are competing for the same food. And we see him get the idea that that he could beat his fellow man over the head with this. And then that would leave all the food for him. So we sort of see the first murder take place in the film, right? And so even if you don't believe in Adam and Eve, literally, it's the concept that matters, that long, long ago, our species evolved to the level of conscious moral agency. And we started to make bad choices. We started to turn the good things in nature to evil, coercive purposes, right? So that by and large, evil around the world is not God's fault because God didn't create evil. It's our fault because we spoiled the goodness and turned it toward bad ends with our choices. Well, Hick does not think that this works at all. First of all, the deterioration of the proper form of things is not a good definition of evil in Hick's eyes for a couple of reasons. Good things can deteriorate, goodness can deteriorate without it even being evil. So like if there's an earthquake, but it's out in the middle of nowhere and no one gets hurt, we don't say that, we don't count that as part of the problem of evil. But if an earthquake happens in the middle of a city and 100,000 people die, then we say that's part of the problem of evil. So the other thing about the natural evils like the earthquake is that it seems impossible to relate that to free will. Okay, if the social evils are our fault because we've sinned, how is a tornado, a volcano eruption, an earthquake, a hurricane the result of anyone's free will choosing the wrong thing? It doesn't make sense. And that's kind of point number 1 and 3 on your screen right now. Going to point number 2, Hick's other counter argument is that, look, Adam and Eve, or whoever the earliest humans, look, they were either created perfect or they were not. If they were created perfect, they would have never chosen evil, right? If they did choose evil, it implies they weren't created perfect. It means the creator chose not to create them perfectly. So the creator is still on the hook. The creator can still be charged with having some responsibility, even for Adam and Eve choosing evil, because it's proof that they weren't created perfectly by the creator. So putting all this together, Hick is like, this is unrescuable. There's no way to save this. We have to get rid of the Augustinian theodicy, which is basically blaming all the evil in the world on our own free will. It's like, doesn't work, doesn't cut it. Is there anything else that we can find? So he calls that the majority report because he calls it the majority report in the book, John does, that throughout the centuries, it's reported that the answer to the problem of evil is Augustine's answer. And he says, but there's a minority report. There's always been a minority. This is important, John, to call it the minority report, because John doesn't want the Christian thinkers out there. He's still kind of in a Christian context. He's not a pluralist yet when John writes this book. So he doesn't want all his Christian readers to think that he's concocting something totally brand new, like he just got it out of thin air. He wants to say, hey, this does have a strong Christian history behind it. There is a strong tradition of another way of doing theodicy, going all the way back to Irenaeus, and Irenaeus even predates Augustine. So you have this minority report and he says that we haven't been paying much attention to, but this other voice has always been there. We just haven't heard it, right? It's the minority report. And that is that you can have a way that doesn't hinge upon blaming all the evil in the world on free will and still justify why God is tolerating all the evil. And so it goes like this. And this is where we get into some of the real stuff that makes John Hick, right? Looking at Irenaeus had this idea: instead of human beings being fully created at the beginning, like Augustine thinks Adam and Eve were, they were only incompletely made. Human beings, and includes you and me now, we're still only incompletely made. We're half made. Making us is a 2-step process. And so far, only the first step has been completed by God, right? In the second stage, um, we have to, over time, make our own free responses and have our own willing cooperation to acknowledge and recognize God's presence and react to God. Hick is still using the word God because he's still not a pluralist yet. He's going to later use different language than the word God. He's going to later, as a pluralist, talk about the real or the transcendent reality, because God is a word that just some religions use, not all religions use the word God. But at this book, he's still completely in a Christian context. So the idea, again, this is where it's fun to do philosophy of religion. It's like pretend you're God for a minute, right? And you want to create the most magnificent, most virtuous, having virtue, having positive spiritual and moral qualities, the most virtuous creations that you can make. So you want to make human beings, but you want them to be as virtuous as possible. Well, things like courage and compassion, you want your human creatures that you as God are making to have these virtues. Courage and compassion, by definition, are things that have to be freely chosen, right? If you're just sort of robotically programmed to rush in, even if there's danger, to perform a duty, it's not really courage. Courage is if you have real doubt and real temptation, and you really kind of are scared, and you really kind of would just like to run away and save yourself. But instead, you like steel yourself, and you know, there's like that act of will is integral to having courage. And so you want, among other things, as God, you want these human beings you're creating to wind up at the end of the day as courageous, compassionate, brave, temperate, just, fair-minded, etc., all the virtues creatures. You've got to let them develop it on their own. You got to, so what you have to do is you have to do a two-stage creation process. You have to create them with enough intelligence and emotions and free will and the other faculties that they're sort of set up correctly to start developing virtues. And then you have to sit back and let it happen. It means they have to be put in a kind of place. What kind of place do you as God have to place these creatures in so that soul making can happen? They're making their own soul. So I put this picture. I think this is one of the best things to represent what John Hick is about. This is one of the statues that Michelangelo made that was never finished. And it's of St. Matthew, one of the authors of one of the four Gospels in the New Testament. And it's half finished. And this is kind of emblematic of what Irenaeus and Hick think that you are. Like, look at that statue for a second and imagine it being you. Like, you're half made. Like, you kind of know who you are. Like, look at this guy in the statue. Like, if it was an animated statue, if this statue came to life, he wouldn't be able to move around yet. He's stuck. He's not finished being, but it looks like maybe he could open his eyes and see, and he could open his mouth and talk, and he could maybe move that one arm, you know, maybe wiggle a little bit, but it's like, now imagine he can move that arm and you could put a chisel in it and he could start chiseling himself out. This is what some of the existentialist philosophers whom Hick had read said. This is what Jean-Paul Sartre said that every human being is like, is that we're like a sculpture, a sculpture, not a sculptor who makes sculptures, but a sculpture, the work of art itself, a sculpture reaching out and finishing sculpting itself. We're sort of thrown into the world, not completely made yet. This is what, and a lot of people think the existentialists were the first ones to say something like that. No, Irenaeus, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years earlier, was one of the first to say that. Hick agrees with it. So you're God, you want human beings to be like this. You want to halfway make them and set them up in the right way that they can finish making themselves, because you want them to freely choose it, or they won't really be spiritually mature. So you need to put them in a place where they can attain, to quote Hick on the screen, they can attain goodness by meeting and eventually mastering temptations, and thus rightly making responsible choices in concrete situations, right? And so on and so forth. That means they have to be in an environment where actions have consequences that are predictable. That means you have to have things like the laws of physics, the laws of nature, right? You have to have You have to have them in an environment where if you don't if you don't work up in the summertime and save up food to get you through the winter, you might starve in the middle of winter. So that you have to think about planning ahead and being responsible and not being lazy. Just as one of many, many examples. You have to be in an environment where there's sort of cause and effect that is physically predictable. You have to be able to cause your fellow human beings pain or pleasure. You have to be able to know that there are moral consequences of your actions. So you've got to create that kind of place. So see the parallel in the attack in the last book was John was saying, if there is a God, we should expect the universe to be ambiguous. Oh, it is ambiguous. Now he's saying, if there's a God, we should expect that God would have put us in a place where we have to work a lot of it out for ourselves and actions have consequences and so on. Even the natural evils, because sympathy is one thing we need to develop, right? And so we feel a kind of sympathy for people who suffer random accidents that we don't feel in any other. It's different feeling sorry for your friend who got beat up because she got in a fight with someone else because they were arguing over a parking space. And it's kind of partly her fault, both people's fault, versus if just like an earthquake happened and a bunch of children die. It's a different feeling, isn't it? And so it engenders sympathy in a certain kind of way. And also you can't be suspending, you can't be a God and create a world where the laws of physics mostly happen, except when it's inconvenient and would result in a disaster. Why? Because that would violate the ambiguity of the universe. Remember, we have to have the ambiguity of the universe, right? What if when there's an earthquake, suddenly the law of gravity was suspended and the piece of building falling down stopped midair and waited for the children to run out of the way and then fell the rest of the way down? It wouldn't be an ambiguous universe anymore, would it? Right? It would be like a miracle. Like if there were miracles that defied the laws of physics every day, there would be incredibly strong evidence of this transcendent supernatural reality out there. And then it wouldn't be very free to choose whether to believe in the transcendent or not. So again, Hick is saying, if there's a God, we should expect not only an ambiguous universe, but we should expect part of that ambiguity to be that there are pretty consistent laws of nature of cause and effect that result in a lot of painful consequences a lot of the times for us. So in other words, it's just the kind of place that we actually are in. So you've already fundamentally got the theodicy, but there's some wrap-up steps that Hick has to do in order to finish the book. First of all, a bit of background. Saint Anselm is famous for a definition of God. One of the most important sentences in the whole history of the philosophy of religion is this: God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. This is like the rules of the game for how to do philosophy of religion when it in so many subjects and so many topics you wouldn't believe it. What it means is that if you and I are arguing, debating each other about what God is like, right? If at any point I can show that on your definition of God, God is not as great, not as powerful, not as loving, not as all-embracing as on my concept of God, we're done. I've just proved that yours needs to be rejected, right? Because if you got a concept of God that makes God less than my concept, then because God is the greatest that there could be, yours can't be right. It doesn't prove that mine is right, because there might be another definition someone else had that's even better than mine, but it does prove yours is wrong if you're conceiving of God as being lesser so than the way I can conceive of God. Unless you can show my concept is self-contradictory, in which case it's not a legitimate concept to begin with, right? If I'm trying to say square circle, triangle with four sides, So this is the way we argue about what is God. Is we look at two rival concepts, A versus B, and whichever one is greater is sort of the winner, unless the other one contradicts itself. Because not even God can make a square circle, because there's nothing there to be made. It's like an illusion of words when you can say, if God is so great, why can't God make a square circle? Because square circle is nonsense speak. There's nothing there to be made. You're not really describing a makeable concept. So this is just some background. Why does that matter so much here? Oh, because Hick is developing a concept of God that all the conservative and orthodox theologians of the world are going to absolutely hate. And what's going to save Hick is Anselm, is this definition on the screen. So Hick has this irony and theodicy, right? That God wants to make souls. He has to first halfway make us and let us finish making ourselves, has to put us in an environment. What if it doesn't finish correctly? Because we have free will. What if it doesn't finish? What if most of us end up never finish making ourselves and we just end up miserable forever? Then the theodicy still wouldn't work. It still wouldn't work. According to John, because there's like the Holocaust, right? 6 million Jews exterminated. There's terrible. We were talking about Hitler, terrible things. You know, some Christians only believe that a small minority of the human race ever goes to heaven. The road is narrow. The wider road, because there's so many more people on it, is the road that goes to hell, right? And John Hick looks at that and he's like, if that's true, only a few people finish the soul making process and go to heaven, and the majority end up in hell, then I wouldn't want to even believe in God. Like, that's a terrible God. But remember Anselm, right? That's like a not very successful God, right? God says, I want to make millions and billions and billions of souls and get them all to heaven. I'll put them in an environment where they can sort of finish making themselves into worthy souls. Oops, didn't go so well. Only a few of them make it. The vast majority go to eternal misery. It's not a very successful God. So remember the Anselmic framework. Hick says, wait a second, how could I conceive of a much more successful God than that? Then according to Anselm, my conception of God would be proven as being closer to the truth. And then Hick says, I know, everybody eventually finishes the soul-making process. So it's called universalism or universal salvation. Hick believes this is necessary because he's really impressed by the problem of evil, takes it super seriously. He thinks there's so much evil in the world that nothing can justify God watching this go on short of a limitlessly better state for everyone eventually in the future, at the end of the soul-making process, at the culmination of the whole future history of creation. And that's what he, basically says here. If the soul-making purpose fails, there can surely be no justification for the heavy and weary weight of all this unintelligible world. Right now, we get back to the eschatological verification. See the connection between these books. Right? Clearly the soul-making process doesn't finish successfully in this life, in this world. But if it could keep going, if it could continue, to be continued, if it could continue in the next life, maybe in some other world, until it ultimately finishes, even Hitler will learn his lessons, right? Might take him much longer than you or me, because he's really bad. It might take him longer. He might be buried deeper, whatever. But yeah, Hick believes in this book, everyone will be saved, even Hitler. Again, why? Because only a universally positive outcome could justify God tolerating all this temporal, material evil and suffering that's going on. Now, Hick has had a lot of respect for free will, but wants to believe that everyone will be saved. How can he know we're going to all be saved if we all have free will? What if some of us are super duper stubborn? Who's the most stubborn person you know? Is it yourself or is it someone else? Imagine, and who's the most negative person you know that has just a bleak, nihilistic, dark view of the world? Imagine the person that's the most negative and the most stubborn that you know. Maybe it's you, maybe it's someone else. Do you think they could refuse to play ball with God like forever? Could they refuse to participate in the soul making process forever? And even if they were reincarnated 1,000 times and were given 1,000 lifetimes, could they maybe be, I don't want to be good. I don't want to open myself to love and compassion. I don't want to be religious. I don't want to acknowledge God. Could they do that infinitely? Hick thinks it's a practical certainty, or elsewhere he says a virtual certainty, that everyone will be saved. So he's a universalist, but not because he can prove that it's guaranteed, rather that he can argue sort of a probabilistic argument that it's a practical certainty. What does that mean? Let's talk about common sense. Practical means like common sense for all practical purposes. If you believe these dice are not loaded, they're fair dice, and somebody asks you, let's make it matter. Let's say you're going to bet 1,000 euros yes or no on whether I will roll 3 6s by rolling these dice over and over and over again. And well, you mean on the first roll? No, I say I'm gonna get to roll these dice 1,000 times. And as long as I get 3 6s eventually in 1,000 times, then you win 1,000 euros. Would you take that bet? Or do you want to bet that I'll roll 1,000 times and still never get 3 6s? Oh, wait, what if I change it? What if I say 10,000 times? What if I say 1,000,000 times? What if I say infinity? I can roll the dice as many times as I want forever. I can live forever. Do you think I'll eventually roll 3 6s? You can't prove it. If you take your mathematics classes, your statistics classes, it just shrinks to a lower and lower and lower and lower chance of me still not getting 3 6s the more rolls I have. But it never reaches 0. There's never a 0 chance of me getting 3 6s. So this is what Hick thinks it's like with universal salvation and eschatological verification. He thinks that in the eschaton, the end of all things, we will verify that God has succeeded in bringing everyone to salvation. The soul-making process is completed perfectly for every individual. But he thinks it's like the statistical curve of this dice roll. He thinks that because of free will, it's in theory possible that it could that some individual could continually sort of stubbornly refuse to get along with the soul-making process. But the God is like a therapist or a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist who sort of can try, and God is infinitely wise and has an infinite number of tries. If God could do anything God wants, God could reincarnate Adolf Hitler 1,000,000 times, 1,000,000,000 times, a quintillion times, a quintillion times, and try a different mode and a different environment and different people to meet the reincarnated Adolf Hitler again and again and again and again and again. And eventually will, as a practical certainty, but not a logical certainty, as a practical certainty, will eventually bring everyone around, even Adolf Hitler. So what does this mean? It means John Hick doesn't believe in hell. Does not believe in hell. So out with the old hell, right? This is kind of the old hell. The idea was that this is why the Augustinian theodicy is so bad. It's all about free will. And if you choose to refuse God, it's your own dang fault and you go to hell. Oh, and by the way, the vast majority of you are going to go to hell probably. Try to be one of the few who won't. Terrible, terrible. Cannot do theodicy, says John Hick. So I try to think of that little figure, that little guy in the picture as being John. And he's going up to the old hell to like prove that it's bogus, to prove that it's illusion. It's like in the movie The Wizard of Oz. There's this big scary looking thing, but it's just a facade. It's fake. Instead, here's the new hell, if you can even call it hell. And the door is always open. And in fact, it's empty. And there's John again in the distance coming to check. This is the eschatological verification happening with John, right? Gazillions of years from now. He has to, because he is empiricist about this. He believes you have to check empirical verification. He expects that at the end of everything, right? In theory, you could choose to isolate yourself from God and stay away from God. Anytime you want, so the gates to hell are always open, like in this picture. Anytime you want, you can come to God. Nobody's forcing you. The definition of hell is separation from God. Hell is defined as just separation from God. And and it's only if you choose. Only if you choose to be separated from God will you be separated from God. You can come back anytime you want. It's not very fun to be separated from God. So it's kind of a mental illness. You kind of have a soul sickness. You kind of need a psychiatrist a little bit if you want to stay away from God, but you can do it. But eventually, of your own free will, everyone eventually will open themselves to love and to God. And so there will be nobody in this hell. But John is coming to check and make sure that this place is evacuated and is vacant and is empty. So this kind of permanently changed the discussion of philosophy of religion, this book. Literally in the mainstream universities, so other than the Bible banger colleges that are strongly affiliated with like an evangelical conservative denomination, those are in a separate, putting those aside. So like in all the good colleges and so on, even the conservative orthodox philosophers of religion, it's over. None of them are trying to defend the orthodox, the old idea of hell anymore. And it's because of John Hick. It's because of this book. Like he demolished it. He demolished it. And he said, he basically said, look, I can conceive of a God that saves everybody, right? Unless you can prove that that's a logical contradiction, then via Anselm, my God is greater than yours. My conception of God has to be closer to the correct conception. So the best that conservative critics of Hick can do, there are people who really cling, they're professors today right now, really want to cling to hell. They want to have a hell, right? The best they can do is have a new kind of hell. They can have a softer, kinder hell. So the only thing any serious critics of John that are taken seriously are trying to do is they're trying to go back to this picture and they're trying to argue that it's not quite empty. That's about it. It's about all they can do. All they can do is go back to those dice rolls and say, somebody's never gonna, Hitler is never gonna roll 3 6s. He says, they can say, I believe that, at least some people are gonna be so spiritually stubborn and spiritually sour of their own choosing that they're gonna permanently forever and ever and ever stay here. That's still a big disagreement with John Hick. He agrees, no, it's a practical certainty. God is so clever and wise and patient that God will never stop finding ways to appeal to every soul, to coax them, but without forcing them, to restore and perfect their soul and come into union with God. And other folks, the best they can defend is saying, but because there's free will, technically it still could be that some people could infinitely refuse to do that. And so there may be some people in this hell, it might not be empty. And that's kind of where the debate is. But like this is ancient history. I mean, John Hick killed this. The only people still arguing this in universities are in Bible colleges that are not part of the serious discussion at schools like Oxford and Cambridge and Yale and Harvard and Claremont and University of Chicago and University of Notre Dame and so on, and University of Tübingen in Germany and on and on and on around. Like none of those universities is anybody defending this. At most, they're defending something like this, but not quite empty. So just massive. You couldn't imagine more massive impact on the history of philosophy of religion. Have I missed any questions or any hands coming up? In my screen, I can see you guys, but the picture is real small on my screen.
So no questions right now, Tim.
Okay, all right. We will sort of zoom forward. A quick interlude. I've been saying again and again, John Hick is not yet a pluralist, not yet a pluralist. Well, in between this book and the next book is when John sort of wakes up into the to the pluralism thing. And a lot of that's because living in Birmingham, England, which is a real multicultural city, and also traveling to India and for a while in other places, he just got surrounded by people of other faiths. And so that made him really think about it. And he already had all the intellectual tools to be a pluralist. He just hadn't connected the dots yet. And he started to say to himself, wait a minute, I have this experiencing as thing. I have this duck rabbit thing. I have this ambiguous universe thing. Doesn't that mean that a Buddhist and a Hindu and a Christian and a Jew would all experience the transcendent reality as something a little different, right? Maybe one is a personal God and the other as an impersonal force, and so on and so forth. So I better think about this pluralistically from the standpoint of all the religions of the world. So he wrote this book, God and the Universe of Faith, to talk about the Copernican revolution, which David Cheatham interacted with the audience on Monday. So we all know what that is now. Instead of thinking that you're the center of the universe, the earth and all the planets and suns and stars revolve around you, you realize you're not the center, you're just revolving around something else that is the center. So with this book, John has changed. He's saying, I'm no longer going to go through Christian eyes at all my topics. I'm not going to be Christianity centered. I'm going to see Christianity as one of several religions that is sort of orbiting around the ultimate reality, the transcendent reality, trying to grasp it in different ways. Or maybe quoting Rumi, Hick would quote Rumi's famous quotation sometimes, the lamps are many, the light is one. The lamps are many, the light is one. Or Dan, can you remember, it was another Muslim scholar who was famous, like, I'm embarrassed, I can't think of the name, who said that the water takes on the color of its container, right? The water takes on the tint of the glass that it's in, is another one. So he started to take that perspective. But he's still not done following up on the previous books. Remember, eschatological verification is very important. And life after death. Now that replicate theory, which was kind of that weird, a little bit, it felt a little kooky, the experiment, the guy disappears in England, reappears in Australia. That's just a thought experiment. That's not necessarily what John seriously believes. He was just using it as a thought experiment to demonstrate the logical possibility. What John really wants to do, because he's very empiricist, is he wants to look around the world now at all the world religions, at all the evidence, at all the stories, at all the arguments for and against life after death. And he wants to sort of verify the evidence on both sides, right? And so since the last book, he's been calling this epistemic distance, remember, that we should expect God to put us in an environment where God hides God's self just enough so that we have to work at it a little bit to be able to perceive God. That's actually what God wants, because that's what's conducive to soul making, to us being co-creators with God of our own souls. So Hick now feels like he has to empirically check. He has to do his homework. He has to go and check if there's, on the one hand, some suggestive evidence around the whole world, because he's not Christocentric anymore. He's pluralist now. If there's enough evidence around the world to be suggestive of life after death, but not so much evidence that it's like compelling and provable, right? And he continues to talk about God as a psychiatrist, and he'll include non-Christian concepts. And then he introduces very importantly, super importantly, he introduces this. We've always had the vocabulary word in philosophy of religion up to this point when John publishes this book, eschatology. Everybody knows what that word is. And John coins this new related word, paraschatology. Paraschatology, like something that sort of is alongside your eschatology, that sort of supplements your eschatology, but isn't exactly your eschatology. Why is that important? Why does that matter so much? It turns out it's going to matter a whole lot. We'll see why. So he takes us on this grand tour of all the possible evidence. Now speaking of a transcendent reality rather than just speaking of God, of the word God all the time. And I'm going to give you a couple examples. We don't have time to go through all of them. The book is so long, it's so thorough. It's packed full of information. But I'm going to go through just 2 examples of where Hick examines the evidence and finds it to be sort of suggestive, but in the end, ambiguous. One of them is mediums. You know, these mediums that conduct seances where they supposedly can channel communication so that you can talk to someone who's deceased, like in the afterworld, and ask them questions, right? And Hick accepts right away that most of these people are frauds, right? But do you know that there are some of these that have been very well documented that it's more difficult to dismiss them as frauds? There are some of these mediums, and he names them, and you can look, and he's not making it up. You can go to the library and look up all the evidence, especially a few of these in the late 19th and early 20th centuries that were tested by skeptics again and again and again and again. They tried as hard as they could to debunk them. And some of these mediums, they could consistently hold a seance and start speaking as though they were the mouthpiece or the spokesperson for a deceased person. And they could be asked very detailed questions about that person's life and come up with correct answers and correct facts that could thereafter be verified. Things like, whatever, I fell down on my bicycle and broke my leg and broke the bicycle, and then your uncle fixed my bicycle for me, or whatever. And then somebody would verify that. But that's not even the most impressive part. The impressive part is they would intentionally bring random cases of people. They would verify. These were skeptics doing these studies, including the Russians, the Soviet Union, the Soviet Union has a doctrine that all religion is false. Therefore, the Soviet Union does not want to believe in the afterlife at all. And they invested money and research into trying to disprove mediums. And they made sure they were bringing somebody that the medium herself had never met. And then they furthermore made sure that nobody sitting around the table knew this deceased person either. And in many cases, the medium even came up with facts about that person's life that the researchers at the time didn't know yes or no whether it was true. Random things like, one time I was shoplifting in Mr. Baxter's store and he caught me, but he was nice and he let me go, and I begged him never to tell my mother, and he never did, right? Like that. And they're like, what the heck? And like nobody involved knew whether that was yes or no. And then they had to do homework, and like weeks later, months later, they get a hold of old Mr. Baxter and they find out that little story is true. And like nobody knew it, right? Like incredibly impressive cases. So even researchers that were motivated to debunk these, you know how they debunked them? The Russians wanted so bad, the Soviets wanted so bad to say these mediums are fake, is that they actually said telepathy is real in order to be able to say life after death is not. They could find they encased the mediums in rooms lined with lead. They made sure everybody that knew the deceased was like 1,000 miles away from the medium. They thought that maybe distance would make her unable to do it, that she was doing it by telepathy, because they believe no way is there life after death. So what she's doing is she's reading the minds of people who are still alive, who know things about the deceased. And they thought if she's doing that, then maybe if nobody who knew the deceased is in the room, or we get her 1,000 miles away. Russia's a very big country, so they could do that. We get her 1,000 miles away from anybody that knew the deceased. They still didn't stop her from making correct readings. So let's also line the whole room with lead. Maybe lead will stop. They thought of telepathy as maybe like a radio wave that they couldn't stop these mediums from making correct readings. Like incredibly impressive. But Hick still doesn't think that it proves there's life after death, right? Because most of the examples are very, very rare. 99 out of 100 mediums are frauds. It's only 1 out of 100 that seem like they're more interesting cases. Most of the strong cases date back to the late 19th, early 20th century. There haven't been any. It's suspicious that there haven't been any mediums in the last 70, 80 years that have apparently as good a track record as a few of them did in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And Hick points out that telepathy is still a possibility. It's again, what is in principle logically possible? It's logically possible that telepathy works through a lead wall and at over 1,000 miles length, and that the medium is just using telepathy to get information about the deceased from other people that know that information who are still alive. And yet another alternative way to explain it is a psychic factor or psychic residue. You know, like a footprint, your footprint or your shadow. You know, your footprint is kind of like a shadow, except you could be dead and your footprints could still be here, right? So think of like a psychic footprint. There could be some kind of psychic factor that there's no life after death, but a little bit of your thoughts and feelings are sort of absorbed in this sort of psychic network that sort of flows through all the people who are still alive. And so it can still be picked up on and read by, and there are rare people who can read that psychic residue, and those are the successful mediums. So they're reading leftover psychic residue in this world. They're not actually getting it from someone who's survived after death into the next world. So see this ambiguity of the universe again. Hick is continuing to verify. He's saying, wow, this is pretty suggestive evidence here of some of these very few best cases, but it falls short of actual proof that there's life after death. It's kind of just enough to blend us back into that ambiguous universe and that epistemic distance again. Let's look at another one. Recollections of past lives. Dr. Ian Stevenson is an American medical science professor from America who passed away recently. He went through hundreds and hundreds of cases at the time that John wrote this. It ended up being thousands of cases, and rejected the vast majority of them, where people claimed they had really good evidence of someone recollecting a past life, that they could verify that past life was actually accurate. And he collected the 20 best cases that he thought were really, really good and put them in this book, and John read it and talked about it in Death and Eternal Life. And in these cases, the children started saying things when they were very, very young, like 2 and 3 years old. You know, I have a different name and I have different friends. So like maybe think of a little girl named Jenny, and she's only 2 years old, and she's playing with blocks, and she tells her mom, "Why do you call me Jenny? My name's Susie." And the mother goes, "What?" And Jenny goes, "Yeah, my name was Susie before it was Jenny. You know, and I had a brother named Albert, but we were in an accident on a bus and we died." Like, what? So the mother probably, you know, depending on the culture of the mother. Now, if that mother is a conservative evangelical Christian in Abilene, Texas, in the United States, in the buckle of the Bible Belt, she's going to dismiss this, right? But if she's living in a culture that does believe in reincarnation, she might give it a moment's pause. But probably Dr. Ian Stevenson will never hear about the example. But in some minority of cases, the mother, the father who hear this child saying things like that, they will stumble across something. Maybe the mother a year later is talking to one of her friends in some shop or some store or something, and it's her friend that they share funny little stories, and she shares this funny little story about, "Oh, my daughter Jenny said her name used to be Susie," and she tells the story, and then by sheer coincidence, right, the shop owner says, wait a second, I used to have a customer, I think, who had 2 kids, and one of them was named Susie and died in a bus accident. And I think that she had a brother that might have died too, and they lived over in this town. Now the mother is kind of freaked out. She's like, what? There could be some truth to this story. She later goes over to this other town, goes into the newspaper office, asks for back issues starts combing through all the newspapers articles of the year before Jenny was born. And then until she finds this article that says bus accident and lists the name of the deceased, and two of the deceased are Susie Rosenthal and Albert Rosenthal, matching perfectly what her daughter Jenny said at the age of 2 a year ago. Now the mother is really freaked out, is really excited, is really crazy. And she tracks down that family in that city and maybe introduces them, invites them over for tea. And now, by now, Jenny is 4 years old, 5 years old. And when this other family from this other city that lost their son and daughter in a bus accident, when the father walks in the door, the very first moment, this mother sees her daughter, who she calls Jenny, instantaneously go, "Papa," and run and jump in his arms. Cases like that. And in a minority of these cases, they had heard somebody was a friend, a neighbor, whatever, had heard of Dr. Ian Stevenson's research and had contacted him. And in some cases, he and his research staff flew over to whatever country that was, and they were there to record everything at the time of the meeting. Like remarkable, remarkable cases. And it's a book, this book on the screen is well worth reading. John thought that it was worth reading. John Hick read it. Again, Hick is impressed by the evidence, think that it's useful, it's relevant, it's suggestive that these could really be recollected lives, but he complains about it in a few ways. Most of the stories are from cultures where everyone believes in reincarnation, so they'd be more hospitable to that view. All the reports are of recent lives, of a very recent life, not from like 100 years ago, 400 years ago. And then John points out they could still be given alternative explanations, just like the mediums. Maybe these little children have incredible telepathic powers and they're just somehow telepathically reaching out. So John kind of does what the Soviet scientists did. He says, well, he resorts to believing in telepathy. Maybe these rare children are somehow telepathically connecting to one particular family who lost someone. It's kind of a stretch, but maybe there's another way to explain this. So kind of what happens, and I'm gonna start moving faster so that we can finish before we run out of time. We have about a half an hour left, is that again, Hick finds the evidence for and the evidence against to be roughly equal. And there's a quote from him in the book. At this stage, we have to record an interim verdict of not proven. So at the end of this, even when John compares things in India and Asia that come from Buddhist and Hindu circles, he comes to the same conclusion again. On the screen here, I'm not able to come to a clear-cut conclusion either that the doctrine of reincarnation is true or that it cannot be true. So you really have to go through all the examples. I'm just highlighting, I'm just giving a couple of examples, but it's a really exhaustive, really complete, and there are many, many more examples from around the world that John Hick examines in this book. The way he wraps it up with his religious pluralism is to introduce this concept of paraeschatology, right? Because John wants to say that there's a single transcendent reality and a single eschatological result that is going to be true for everyone. Yet the different cultures, religions around the world seem to have completely different, incompatible, irreconcilable conceptions of what the afterlife is. So now we're going to get back to that experiencing as thing and everything. A paraeschatology to John, because he sort of invents the word, it describes the immediate first phase after death, when you're just transitioning out of this life into whatever comes next. So it's sort of the beginning of the end, or the beginning of the next, the beginning of whatever's next after this life. Your doctrine of that is your paraeschatology. The real final end of the end is your eschatology. So what does that do? That enables John to say that the immediately post-mortem phase is subjective and dreamlike, and can take any of a number of different forms. So if you're raised a Christian, this sort of dreamlike thing that happens right after you die, it's like you will experience it as going before Jesus to be judged at the final judgment. But if you're a Hindu raised in India, you're going to maybe experiencing it as floating around, looking down on different families into which you could be reincarnated until you see one particular pregnant mother into whose womb your soul could float down and move into. And you experience it as that because you were raised a Hindu and you were taught that that's the way things go. So the paraeschatology in Hinduism is different than the paraeschatology in Christianity. And it could be that when we have, and the reason that we have these is because of maybe near-death experiences. When someone has a near-death experience, it might trigger this immediately post-mortem phase. And when they're a Christian, they experience it as going through a tunnel until they go before a final judge. But when they're a Hindu, they experience it as whatever their cultural norms are for how to experience that. And so this is a way of John reconciling again that there could be a single universal way that this really goes, but that the initial phase is sort of a subjective dreamlike phase that is partly shaped just by your cultural programming, your cultural conditioning that you had in this life. And that's the only part of it that we ever recollect in those limited cases where people have a near-death experience, they report that, and then that forms that sort of becomes self-reinforcing. But that really, we need to see past the paraeschatological phase that there might be a single constant outcome. So what does John Hick really believe in, though? He actually does tell us at the end of the book. He disclaimerizes this, that it's pure speculation, but that at the end of all of his study, what he thinks actually, and this is remarkable because remember, he was a Christian in the earlier books. And he's becoming more and more progressive and open-minded as he moves on decade to decade to decade, right? And now he comes out and says he actually believes it's reincarnation, something almost no Christians believe, right? So he's really been open-minded to this interfaith dialogue. And it's because of the soul-making process from the last book, Evil and the God of Love. He thinks that he thinks that in this lifetime, you can tell by people are not perfect people by the time they die, right? That one lifetime isn't enough. If one lifetime isn't enough to complete the soul-making process, or that statue of Saint Matthew, he needs to reach out with a chisel and help complete sculpting himself. If one lifetime isn't nearly enough, 2 lifetimes isn't either. So therefore, John arrives at inferring it probably takes multiple lifetimes for most of us to finish the soul-making process. And to do that, it would have to be into another world. It would have to be into another world that would have its own spatio-temporal environment, where it would also have laws of physics with our actions would have consequences. So it'd have to be into a world somewhat similar to ours. It could be this very same world. It could be another world. It could be another planet. It could be another world on a different modality. It could be, if you want to go back to the theoretical physicists, it could be another universe in the multiverse. Doesn't matter what it is, but it would have to be a world where we would have the environmental ingredients needed to continue the soul-making process. So we go back to St. Anselm again, and I'm just being kind of flippant here on this slide. I'm saying that, John is just continually in every book, he's really getting in the face of all the conservative and orthodox theologians, just worse and worse with every one of these books, because now he's not only a universalist who did away with hell, now he also believes in reincarnation. And he's like, reincarnation plus universalism equals I have a bulletproof theodicy and I have a scatological verification of a truly great, truly successful ultimate reality that if you're a Christian, you could call God. And he's sort of saying, beat that. And so, Anselm, the sort of ghost of Anselm is kind of saying, I approve, right? Because John has sort of carved out a conception of a very powerful, very loving God who accomplishes ultimate success, and that there is in principle a way that we can eventually verify that after death, and that it can encompass all the religions of the world. So God hasn't abandoned the Hindus or the Buddhists to an inferior methodology, that all around the world, this soul-making process is moving and is working. So we've got like 20 minutes left. So we're gonna have to skim over some things, but it's okay. The next book is really John's magnum opus. But what it does is it's really all inclusive. This book is like the last 3 books together in one plus more. And in it, John defines religion. He gives a definition of religion as a family resemblance concept. And this comes from Wittgenstein again. You see so much borrowing from Wittgenstein and John. Wittgenstein talked about a lot of concepts being a family resemblance concept, where there isn't one fixed definition of a word. There's just a long list of characteristics or attributes, and something counts as a certain kind of thing if it just has a lot of or most of those attributes, but there isn't any one of those attributes necessarily. It has to be essential. Wittgenstein's example is a game, and he mentions board games, ball games, card games, and so on. And so you see the Venn diagram there. It might be that game A and game B have some of the same features, and game B and game C have some of the same features, but game A and game C may not have any of the same features or not very many of the same features. And so the reason he calls it family resemblance is it's kind of like this. You can kind of look at the family that's in the box, and you can look at the faces, and you can see that every one of those 4 faces has some resemblance to each of the other 3 faces, but there isn't any one thing that's in all 4 members of that family, is there? They don't all 4 have the same eyes, the same nose, or the same mouth. And you can tell that the 2 faces on the right don't belong to that family. They don't have any family resemblance to that family. So Hick picks this up and he says, why not apply that to religion? So this isn't from Hick. This is just stream of consciousness from me, but Hick just says, look, there are a lot of characteristics of religions that not every religion has every one of these characteristics, but in a family resemblance way, a la Wittgenstein, a religion is something that has just sort of a critical mass of these features. And you can make your own list, and you can make many, many more. This is an incomplete list, but let's do the little thought experiment. What if, almost randomly pick, this is 20 features, you could just randomly pick 10 out of the 20, circle them, and imagine if something had just those features, but not the other 10 features, would it still count as religion? Here's an example. What if something just had what's in red? Would it be a religion? So it would have a canonical text, like a scripture. It would have a special house of gathering. There would be stories that they would hand down. They would do chants. They would follow the golden rule. They believed in the soul. They believed in life after death, but they don't believe in heaven, and they don't believe in hell, and they don't even believe in a transcendent reality, but they have a call to transform oneself, and they have a founding figure. They don't have any prophets. They don't have prophecy. They don't have saints. They don't do rituals. What would it count as a religion?
In my personal opinion, I think it should definitely be everything counted as a religion, because a religion is something we as people basically build up and develop further through history, right? So I think we should have the right to because this is something we want to be able to hold on to and believe in and develop through and live our life by. I think it should definitely be able to be called as a religion, specific features probably through development of time and change of ways of thinking, etc. So I think yes.
Well, I think John Hick would agree with you, because he even said that Marxism could be thought of as a secular faith. Sounds like a contradiction in terms, but you look at this list. I'll go back to the original list. I mean, Marxism, they have a canonical text. They have the Communist Manifesto, and they have a founding figure, Karl Marx, right? And they don't believe in heaven and hell or life after death, right? But they do have laws and rules, right? They usually have a utilitarian ethics, and they have slogans. They don't have songs. Actually, they do have songs. Bella ciao, bella ciao, bella ciao, ciao, ciao. That one, that one, and others. And they have songs, and they have slogans, and they have they have sort of an official creed, and they don't, they don't dream of the afterlife or eschatology, but they do dream of this ultimate end of overthrowing capitalism and instituting like a communist paradise, right? So you could even, it's debatable, but you could even maybe say that Marxism is a religion or a quasi-religion, almost religion. So yeah, Hick would agree with you that you know, this would be a religion. Almost anything that has even half of these characteristics could count as a religion in some sense. So based on that, Hick narrows his focus in this book to what are called the soteriological religions, which is the same as the post-axial religions. So Karl Jaspers and other scholars before Hick started studying something called the axial age. And it is when there seems to have been a change in religion in the world during about a very tight period. Karl Jaspers originally said about 600 years. Since then, this has been updated, and as we get more information about more religions around the world, the axial period actually is more slippery, and in some parts of the world, in some places, it started earlier than this and later than this, but there always seems to be this, historically, through thousands of years, culturally, this change in religion that happened some time ago. And what it is that the pre-axial religions previous to this were sort of primordial religions that were about seeing a cosmic never-ending cycle of order between gods or deities and nature and humanity, that we just needed to maintain this rhythm, this cadence of this circular dance. You know, God sends rain and then the crops grow, and then, you know, whatever, and, you know, maybe if we do evil, then there will be a drought, but if we repent, God will send rain again. But it's kind of like it's like a never-ending cycle, and it's very communal, and it's community-based. The axial age comes along, and these figures show up. These figures show up like the Buddha and Confucius and Krishna and the late Old Testament prophets and like Isaiah, and they warn the people, and they basically say, you need fixing, and they focus on the individual. They say there's this unsatisfactory nature of life, that there's a lot of suffering or sin or illusion in the world, and that if you don't do something, it's not going to get better, but it can get better because you can do something. And what that is that you can get in contact or a connection with this transcendent reality that will transform you. It'll transform you into a better and more whole person religiously. And then the unsatisfactory thing, whether that's sin or illusion or confusion or pain or whatever it is, it will start to disappear and be replaced with joy and serenity, and so on. So that's called soteriology, which kind of means like, it's kind of related to the word, soter is the word, root word there that means savior. So it's soteriological means they're giving you a framework for how to save yourself. That's what the post-axial religions do. So the major religions in the world now in the post-axial period are all soteriological. And it did in an earlier time on Earth, it didn't used to be that way. Thousands of years ago, religion existed, but it was mostly not soteriological. It was about maintaining an order that was already there. Soteriology is like, the world is broken, you're broken, but I have a fix. I'm the Buddha, I have a fix. I'm Jesus, I have a fix. I'm Muhammad, I have a fix. See how they all kind of do that? That's soteriological post-axial religion. So it has these 5 things: an immediate pessimism, life is bad right now, mixed with a cosmic optimism, but it can get limitlessly better, and it will. 3, there's a transcendent reality. 4, the way to get to the limitlessly better state and away from the immediately terrible state is to connect yourself with that transcendent reality. And then finally, number 5, and here's a roadmap for how to do that. It's not enough to be a religion, a post-axial religion, just to have 1 through 4 as a theory, as just like ideas you say, like philosophically. You have to go to number 5, and here's how to do it. So like the Buddha says, do meditation, work on yourself. You know, in Christianity, they say, go to church, pray every day, sing songs, teach your children the 10 commandments and so on. So they always tell you things to do. that will establish that connection in number 4, that will accomplish your beginning to move from the pessimistic state to the more optimistic state. So if you check everything on this list, then you're a post-axial soteriological religion. So again, empirical, Hick is looking, do all the major religions have all these things? Yeah, they do, right? In Judaism, there's Yatzer Hara, that's an inclination to evil. In Christianity, it's fallenness. In Islam, it's Gafala, which is forgetfulness of God. We don't have time to go through all of these. And in Buddhism, there's dukkha, which is unsatisfactoriness, and so on. They all have a cosmic optimism, something you look forward to. It's called kingdom of God or eternal life or paradise or moksha or enlightenment or nirvana. See how similar all these major religions are? They all have that. They all believe in a transcendent reality, but they call it something different. Is it God? Is it Yahweh? Is it Allah? Is it Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva? Is it the Tao? Is it the Tao? You could add to this list. So they certainly all have the first 3, right? But then people object to Hick doing this, right? They object to him in a number of ways. One is that in exploring this, Hick focuses on the very noteworthy mystical figures in every one of the religious traditions. And he takes them as paramount. So he looks at St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa's Lady Julian of Norwich in Christianity, right? And he looks at Radha Krishan in Hinduism, and he looks at Hakuin in Zen Buddhism, and he looks at all the most impressive mystical kind of figures who had these reputations for being amazingly advanced in spiritual maturity or in their own religion. And he takes those as definitive and paradigmatic. And so Hick's critics will complain, wait a second, you've gotten away from the everyday person just sitting in the pew in church every Sunday who's not a mystical person. And Hick's response is, yeah, but it's appropriate to take the most advanced cases, the most successful, where the soul-making process appears to have most effectively moved forward, as definitive of what we're looking at in each one of the world religions, because all of the ordinary people like you and me, we aspire to be that. So like I met the Roshi Kaido Fukushima, the Zen master that I mentioned earlier, came over and visited from Japan, and he was just an amazing individual to be around. You could just feel how Zen he was. There's just something different about everything he did, just how he walked into the room. But all the little early disciples, the young Zen monks that were around him, they all aspire to be like him. Like the whole reason they're there is to be like him. So Hick defended taking these kind of very special figures as definitive, as the right way to judge and to evaluate all the religions. Another objection is that Hick defines this soteriology as moving from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness. And Hick actually read feminist theologians, and this is a feminist objection that he talks about in his book, where feminist theologians have been saying, wait, a lot of women in the world, they don't suffer from self-centeredness, John. They suffer from the opposite, self-abnegation. Their life is one of subservience to men and subservience to everyone else. And they're kind of the opposite of self-centered. They feel completely demoralized. They don't have a strong enough sense of self. And John Hick comes back and says, you're right, but that's not just women that applies to. You could say that about blacks that have suffered in lots of parts of the world and have been put down. He says, you're right, this matters. You have to have a sense of self at all before you can be self-centered. So if people are suffering in self-abnegation, they have a demolished sense of self-worth. Part of the soul-making process just has to be to build that up as well. You have to get that before you can move anywhere further in the soul-making process, was his response. Finally, and the most serious objection, by putting together the soteriological framework, is John Hick violating the family resemblance concept? I thought with the family resemblance concept, you're saying there's no list of essential features that all religions have. They just have anything, throw darts at the dartboard. Any of these, if they have several of these features, it's a religion. Now you're saying, wait, there's these 5 essential things. Hick's response to that is like, hey, first of all, I was just trying to characterize what separates the post-axial religions, which is what I'm interested in as a scholar, because that's what mostly dominates the world today, from all the pre-axial religions that are mostly gone, except you can find them in some Aboriginal places in Australia and South America and so on in Africa. And he said, second, the soteriological framework is not a finished list of all the attributes that makes up a religion, right? You have to have more than that. Every one of the religions has those 5 things, plus it has a bunch of the other stuff from the first list we looked at: scriptures, songs, rituals, belief in heaven. So all the major world religions, he's saying, have these 5 things plus several more things from that kind of list. So I think you can do it, because you can have a family resemblance concept where you still tag a few of the features as being essential, but the rest, but that's not enough to completely determine what the thing is. It still has to also have almost a random assortment of the rest of the features. Anyway, that's his response to that. Finally, and we're getting really close on time here. Dan, I don't know if Dan's in the room, but you can tell me if there's room to go over a little time, since we got a late start, or not. I can go either way. But John borrows from the philosopher Immanuel Kant to make this distinction between the noumenal world and the phenomenal world, right? And this is just kind of like saying, moving kind of fast through here. This is just like kind of saying that when I mentioned a bat, that a bat has sonar, it's blind, but it has sonar, is that we have to remind ourselves that whenever we experience anything, we're actually experiencing a construct in our mind of what it is. We're not getting a pure raw experience of that thing. So in Kant, the thing in itself is in the noumenal world, and what we experience is the phenomenal world. So we experience a phenomenon that is connected to a noumenon, but we never get to experience the noumenon, right? So it's like saying that the birds that can see in the infrared spectrum, they look at the sky and they see a different sky than what I see. Because when there's a high pressure front 10 miles away, approaching with the wind, I don't see it because I can't see infrared, but they do, because that's warmer. And so in infrared, that part of the sky looks a different color to them than the sky right above the head, right? And so what you need to learn, the lesson from that is not the bird is really seeing the sky. I'm not. The real lesson from that is the bird and me, neither one of us is seeing everything there is to know about the sky. We're seeing a very partial view of it that's filtered through our own cognitive apparatus, right? So Hick borrows this to the religion. If you compare, the religions all seem to be saying this. The opening words of the Tao Te Ching, the main sacred text of Taoism, is the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. In Hinduism, in the Vedas, the ultimate Godhead is Brahman, but they say there's two versions of Brahman, right? There's Saguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman. Saguna means with attributes, Brahman means without attributes. And they'll say that the Nirguna Brahman is the real Brahman that we never get to experience. We only get to experience Saguna Brahman, meaning we have to give it attributes, but our puny finite minds, any attributes we put on the ultimate Godhead are okay, but never exactly right. And so you can keep going. Thomas Aquinas, Roman Catholic, said what is known is in the knower according to the mode of the knower, and so on and so forth. And you can get other. So Hick actually finds evidence in all the world religions of what Kant is saying, but in the religions, it's mystics and saints and gurus applying this kind of distinction to the ultimate transcendent reality. And they seem to all be saying that all of our doctrines and all of our scriptures and all of our statements, they're useful pointers to that, but none of them perfectly or completely captures what the ultimate reality is. So this undergirds Hick's pluralism, because this is how he can say that all the different religions are pointing to the same thing, even though they're saying different things about it, because the different things they're saying about it are all very imperfect and are reflections of the phenomenal world, even though it's tied to one and the same noumenal world. So again, the lamps are many, the light is one. So next, Hick wants to make sure he won't be attacked as opening the floodgates to any and all religion, including bad religion, including fringe, including weird cults, including crazy religion, and that there's no, and that he's saying like all religion is good, it's all okay, and there's no way to judge good from bad religion. He wants to say no, there's criteria, because again, he doesn't want that would make believing in religion look very unreasonable, like it's all subjective. There's no, like you're trying to make it exempt from judgment. He wants to say no, there's criteria for judging when religion is genuine and authentic. So he has the soteriological criteria already. Remember that list of 5 things. The other is production of saints. Is that if a religion is working well, and then it means it's effective in facilitating the soul-making process, which means it should occasionally, at least occasionally, produce some people that are very noteworthy, that appear to be very advanced in the soul-making process. And you can empirically check for that. You can examine the historical record of all the religions and see if that seems to be true. And then there's ethical criteria. All good religions should follow the golden rule, and they should have a commitment to generous goodwill, love, and compassion. And he has arguments for all of this that we don't have time to go into, but these are his criteria. So this thing about checking for saint productions, you might think, how can it be not subjective? How is there an objective way to look at each one of the religions and judge fairly if they produce saints about as effectively as each other, or if they produce saints effectively at all? So he has criteria for what counts as a saint. These are the features you have if you're a saint. You exude, this is the impression you make on everyone around you if you're a saint. And that's Thich Nhat Hanh, he just passed away, but the famous Vietnamese mindfulness Buddhist. A feeling of being in a wider life than that of this world's selfish little interests, a sense of the friendly continuity of the ideal power, et cetera, elation and freedom, a shifting of the emotional center towards love and harmony, a certain serenity and inward peace, and so on and so forth. So Hick looks around the world, and he looks at people experiencing the ultimate reality as either a personal or impersonal concept. An example of the personal one is Yahweh in Israel, also recognized by Christians and Muslims, or the Hindu Krishna. Impersonal ones would be the Atman or Satchitananda of Advaitic Hinduism, or the Dharmakaya of Mahayana Buddhism. Another one would be the Tao in Taoism. And what he finds is that all of these bear all the soteriological framework. All of these produce saints. All of these have produced multiple saints that have all 5 of these features as witnessed to by many, many, many people that they met in their lives, that they made an impression on for exuding all 5 of these qualities. And you can find plenty of saints in all of these religions on the screen here: Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on. And they meet the ethical criteria of going beyond the golden rule to also espouse sort of a beyond the call of mere obligation or duty is the call in all of these religions to go the extra mile, to have compassion for those who are suffering. Those even people to whom you owe nothing, you should go out of a spirit of generosity and help them, even when it's not your obligation to help them. And all these religions teach that, and all these saints that are produced in all these different religions are known for exuding that quality. So in conclusion, Hick has tested out his pluralistic hypothesis. He calls it a hypothesis over and over again. The pluralistic hypothesis is that the different religions are experiencing a single transcendent reality as variously God, the Tao, Jesus Christ, the Dharmakaya, Krishna, and so on. And it doesn't matter that they're experiencing as different things, because it's still the one thing, and they all have a soteriological framework in common that is working effectively in all of them and producing a good number of saints in all of them. So inductively, empirically, we observe that the several major religions are equally robust and effective in their instantiation of all these criteria of soteriology and of producing saints. And so it's a very, very strong argument at the end of his book in favor of the pluralistic hypothesis, which is that there are several religions, not just one, that are actually effective in mediating our lives to a transcendent reality that moves us forward in a soul-making process. That's what he does. And we're like officially going over time, but we'll real quick go into this last book so that we have sort of the completed of this. There's one last thorn in Hick's side. There's one last fly in the ointment, one last problem, is that Christianity, the churches, really are gung-ho about saying Jesus was God in the flesh, so that they think their religion is unique and superior because it was the only one founded by God in person. See, if Christianity was founded by Jesus and Jesus was God in person, and none of the other religions were founded by God in person, then clearly Christianity is superior to the other religions. And Hick just doesn't think that from the last book, he doesn't think it looks like that. He doesn't think that's true. So he has to go and knock down this thing. And back in 1977, he edited a book of essays. One essay was his, and he invited like 10 other scholars. And it's called The Myth of God Incarnate. This made a lot of people hate his guts. This book got him tried for heresy by the Presbyterian Church. He used to be an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church, not anymore after this book. Kicked him out, right? Well, they did it. They tried him twice. The first time they threatened to kick him out, and other professors came to his rescue and got him back in. The second time they were about to kick him out, and he resigned in order to quiet down the controversy, because he didn't want to cause a schism in the Presbyterian Church over this. And so he's picking that up and doing a book, like instead of writing one essay in a volume, he's writing a book length work. And it's about the literal versus metaphorical interpretation of Jesus. Is Jesus the Son of God, literally, or just metaphorically the Son of God? Right. And so his overall argument is that it has to be one or the other. It has to be literal or metaphorical, and it should not be taken literally. Therefore, it should be taken metaphorically. That's like the whole book in 3 sentences. Okay. But first, he has to explain premise 2. Why should it not be taken literally? Most of the book is spent convincing you of premise 2. It should not be taken literally. Why? 5 reasons why. 5 reasons why. So first of all, he's making a cumulative argument. So these arguments, he doesn't expect any one of these arguments to convince you all by itself. But when you put all 5 together, he thinks it's super convincing that a literal interpretation is the wrong way to go. So the first argument, it was not taught by Jesus himself. Jesus himself didn't claim, I'm God. There isn't a passage in the whole New Testament where Jesus says, I'm God. Right? But it's in the church, it's built a lot on the idea of a physical resurrection of Jesus. How could Jesus rose from the dead physically. How could that have happened unless Jesus was divine in some sense? Because normally most of us don't rise from the dead. But Hick points out that the earliest accounts of resurrection looked more like visions, like non-physical resurrection. The Apostle Paul is one of the early ones, and he says that he saw a great light and heard a voice, but he didn't say that he touched Jesus or that Jesus walked around and sat down in a chair and ate a meal or anything like that. And he says that people who are with him could see the light but not hear the voice. So it almost sounds like a hallucination as much as a physical appearance. And it wasn't really until hundreds of years later that the church started teaching that Jesus was metaphysically the Son of God, in the sense of being non-metaphorically, but being of the same nature of God. It wasn't until the Council of Nicaea in 325 that the church officially said, Jesus is of the same essence as God. That's a long time. That's almost 300 years after Jesus was walking the earth. Okay. And so you kind of have a timeline like this. In the sayings of the historical Jesus, the most glorifying thing Jesus ever said about himself, according to historical Jesus scholars, that he actually said, is that he spoke of himself and John the Baptist both as children of wisdom. That's about it. And Paul seems to think of Jesus as a little bit more than a normal human, but maybe someone equivalent to the word or wisdom or the logos or the angels. The Council of Nicaea says Jesus is the same substance of God. And finally, the Council of Chalcedon said that Jesus has two natures. The problem with Nicaea 325 is that if Jesus was the same substance of God, it might mean he was not really human. It might mean that he was God just appearing to look like a human, but wasn't really human. But Christianity decided it's important to say that Jesus is human and God at the same time. We didn't arrive at that until the year 451. So Hick's first argument is like, why should we buy this if it's something that developed by people in the church hundreds of years later, instead of being anything that you could link to Jesus himself? Thomas Morris had come out with this book trying to argue that it makes sense that Jesus could be both human and divine at once. And so it's important to Hick to demolish this argument. And he does it in a lot of ways. So I just pulled out one of his arguments against Morris. And this is one of the places where I can take a little bit of credit. John mentioned me in the acknowledgements of the book because I actually suggested this line of argument to him in class when we were going through Thomas Morris's book. That's my one little, my one little, you know, hooray for myself. But anyway, for Jesus to be God and man at the same time is really hard, because all the attributes that are essential to humanity and essential to God, Jesus has to have all of them. And one of the attributes of God is that for God, it is impossible to sin. God can't possibly sin. But to be human means to have the possibility of sin. Even if you don't sin, you have the possibility of sin. How can it be both possible and impossible at the same time for Jesus to sin? For him to be human, it has to be possible for him to sin, even if he doesn't. For him to be God, it has to be impossible for him to sin. So now you have a square circle. Now you have a contradiction. Now you're trying to ask for there to be a triangle with four sides. You're trying to ask for there to be an entity for whom it is both possible and impossible to sin. So Morris has a way to try to wiggle out of this. He says that if Jesus in his human nature were about to sin, then his divine nature would intervene and stop him before the sin could occur. Right? The problem is that if this is true, then for all we know, Jesus in his human nature could have been the most sinful human who's ever lived. And his divine nature was just constantly stopping it all the time. For all we know. And that would be a hideous way to think of Jesus. And it's kind of a homunculus model. The homunculus is this ancient medieval superstition that people had, that there would be like a little guy, like a little voice inside your head making you do things. And Morris actually constructs something like that, where Jesus has normal human nature, but then inside his mind is another mind, which is the mind of God, saying, no, don't do that, little Jesus. Don't steal the cookies out of the cookie jar. Stop. And like stops him from ever committing a sin. Well, for all we know, the human aspect of Jesus could have been the most sinful human who's ever lived. And we don't know how many times the divine, and it's crazy. So it's a crazy picture that no pious Christian should accept, says John. So moving on to other arguments, and we're actually almost done here. Sorry for going over. The doctrine of divine incarnation has been used to justify Christian superiority, which then has been used to justify Christians' mistreatment of non-Christians for many, many centuries. So this is a pragmatic argument. What are the consequences of this doctrine when it is put into action? And we have centuries and centuries of evidence. We have a lot of evidence that it's very susceptible to being used to justify horrific mistreatment of non-Christians as though they were second-class citizens. So the historical consequences of the doctrine don't look good. Another way to sum up that argument is that if Jesus were God, if Christianity was the only religion founded by God in person, shouldn't we expect Christianity to have a better moral track record than the other religions do? Well, it doesn't. Some of the worst, bloodiest, most shameful religious wars in the history of the earth have been fought in the name of Christianity. So that's kind of another way to look at that argument. Fourth argument. The supposed remember soteriology, like the way of being saved. The supposed soteriological purpose of the doctrine of divine incarnation is horrific and repugnant to Hick. It's called the penal substitution theory. The predominant theory is that we've all sinned, and sin demands a price to be atoned for. And we've sinned so badly, all of us, that we can never pay the price for our own sin, as though it's like taking out a loan that you can never pay back because it gathers interest and you're poor and you'll never ever repay that loan. And someone else who's rich comes in and pays it off for you, something like that. And so there should have been a punishment for all our sins, like we all just deserve to die. But Jesus is so pure because Jesus was God, and Jesus was so innocent, didn't deserve to be punished, that his being hung on the cross and crucified and punished sort of in our place paid the debt clean, paid a debt that I could never pay, that you could never pay, right? This is repugnant to Hick because it actually says that God is willing to punish God's own son, who is completely undeserving of any punishment. Like, just basic morality, one of the most horrific things you can do morally is to punish somebody who doesn't deserve it, right? And yet this doctrine is saying that no less than God did that in the biggest way imaginable to the least deserving person ever. It's like horrific in Hick's eyes. And it's also not needed. Remember the framework of soteriology, if this checklist, if you have all these 5 things, you can accomplish soteriology. Nowhere in there do you need to have there be this doctrine that God came in the flesh. And again, going back to the history, the reason why we looked at the history, Hick can now make the argument, the early church in the 1st century, the 2nd century, the 3rd century, didn't have this doctrine. It came in the 4th and 5th centuries. In the 1st century, right after Jesus' death, the very next year, Jesus' followers were spreading the gospel like it was the greatest news you could ever hear soteriologically, and it could totally save you. And none of them were saying that he was God. So clearly you don't need the doctrine in order to have a good gospel story to tell about Jesus that can save you. Right? Final argument goes back to religious pluralism. And that way that we talked about in the previous book, all the different religions seem to produce these wonderful saints from time to time at about the same level as each other. If Christianity had been founded by God in person, shouldn't it have an advantage? Shouldn't it produce more saints more often, more readily, more easily? The evidence empirically, John says, is it doesn't seem to be that way at all, right? Like Saint Teresa of Avila is very impressive as a Christian mystic, but Rumi, the Islamic Sufi mystic from Persia a few hundred years ago, and Kabir in India, a Hindu, are just as impressive, as are the Zen stories of Hakuin, the Zen master from some hundreds of years ago in Japan. Like all the Christian saints are matched full up with saints in the other religions, that anything approaching a neutral, fair, objective assessment shows this. So that's sort of the final argument of that. And so the key takeaways are that John's pluralistic project is not ruined by Christianity being superior to all the other religions, because the supposed superiority is linked to this one doctrine that Jesus was God, was literally God, which is not a good doctrine because of these 5 arguments that we just went through. And instead, it's perfectly fine to say that Jesus is metaphorically the Son of God, that he had such a strong God consciousness, like God, you can say glorious things about Jesus if you want. He was very conscious of God. He was maybe very advanced in the soul-making process. He could maybe even do miracles of the sort and everything, but it's still not saying he was literally God, right? And so, this really, again, rocked the world of philosophy of religion. This book has very strong arguments in it. It's very difficult for the conservative theologians to deal with. Anyone who writes about Christology, the theory of who Christ was, has to take on Hick. And so this is kind of the 5th and final of his major works. And then last slide, can you believe it? You got, like, give yourself a round of applause, like you made it all the way. It's awesome. You guys are muted. I can't hear it, but this is the last slide. And it's kind of silly, but it's kind of cool. These are some of the major themes: experiencing as, Copernican revolution, all that. And these are the 5 books. And I guess the main takeaway here is each one of these books hits some themes that are also hit by one of the other books. So every one of the books is doing some work to support the themes in the other books. And then that's the first takeaway from this. The other one is look at interpretation of religion, the purple one. It encompasses everything. That's why it is, for my money, an interpretation of the religion, 1989 by John Hick, is in my opinion the best and the most important single book in the entire 20th century in philosophy of religion. And there are hundreds of other scholars out there who would agree with that statement, because it really touches on, it even touches on this metaphor of God incarnate thing that he did a whole book on later, but he touches on it in shorter form in the 1989 book. So it's like, if there's one book, if you're only going to read one book in philosophy of religion representing the entire 20th century, it's an interpretation of religion right there. So, wow, we sort of did it, you guys. Your questions have been really great, and I can't believe that you made it through this whole 3 hour. I feel like you went through the whole 5 years I spent in graduate school with John Hick, but you did it in the last 3 hours.
Well, thank you so much, Tim. And I'm a bit conscious on time here, so I will tell the students if they have any questions for Tim, send them to me, and then I will forward it to Tim, and I'm sure he will take the time to answer when he gets the time.
I absolutely will. Thanks a lot. Apologies for going 15 minutes past or 20 minutes past, but we wanted to wrap it up. And thanks for the opportunity, Dan. Again, this was a fun journey for me to put these slides together for you all. I'm actually working on a book that actually John suggested that I write, where I would go through these 5 books and make my reaction to them, and I would explain the evolution of his thought. So this was sort of, and I have that book about half done. So this was a fun experiment for me to come and present this to you, because it sort of forced me to arrange these thoughts in sequence. And I thank you for providing me that opportunity.
So much. I'll stop the recording now.